Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown. Stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. The old apartment building, the Oak Haven, wasn't just old. It felt ancient, burdened by a century of lives lived and secrets buried within its crumbling brick facade. I, Elias Thorne, a freelance graphic designer, had taken the cheapest available unit on the 5th floor, a studio apartment overlooking a perpetually rain-slicked alley. The rent was impossibly low, a red flag I'd optimistically ignored. But in New York City in 2025, a bargain was a bargain, even if it came with the faint, persistent smell of dust and something vaguely metallic. My first week was uneventful, filled with the usual unpacking and the relentless hum of the city. My only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible chill that permeated my apartment, even with the rattling radiator blasting. It wasn't just cold. It was a damp, clinging cold that seemed to seep into my bones, no matter how many layers I wore. It was worse in the evenings, a creeping dread that made me pull my threadbare blanket tighter around me. Then came the sounds. At first, I dismissed them as typical old building noises. Pipes groaning, wind howling through loose panes, the distant wail of sirens echoing off brick. But they grew more distinct, more unsettling. A faint, repetitive scratching seemed to emanate from the walls of my bedroom, directly behind my headboard. Not frantic, like a mouse, but slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, like nails dragging on plaster. I tried to rationalize it. Old wiring, settling foundations, but the scratching persisted, a maddening rhythm that often continued for hours, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance. I'd press my ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment I focused, the sound would invariably fade, leaving me in the oppressive, damp silence of my small room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts. One evening, I was sketching a new logo design, the only light in my apartment coming from my laptop screen. The scratching had started again, louder now, almost directly next to my ear. I slammed my fist against the wall in frustration. "Stop it!" I yelled, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. The scratching ceased. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, from the very core of the wall came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing. My blood ran cold. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a pipe. This wasn't the wind. This was something else. I scrambled away from the wall, pulling my laptop with me, my eyes wide and unblinking. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the furthest corner of my living room, the faint glow of my laptop a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, I confronted Mrs. Petrov, the ancient, perpetually scowling building manager who lived on the first floor. Her apartment reeked of mothballs and stale cigarettes. "Mrs. Petrov," I began, trying to sound calm, "I've been hearing strange noises in my apartment, like scratching and voices." Her eyes, roomy and dark, fixed on mine. A long, drawn-out puff of smoke curled from her lips. "Noises?" she rasped, her voice like grinding gravel. "Is old building. Always noises." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "You hear voices?" There was a strange emphasis on the word, a subtle shift in her tone that made my skin crawl. "Just a whisper, maybe a giggle?" I stammered, feeling foolish as the words left my mouth. A flicker of something, recognition? Fear? Crossed her weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. She took another slow drag from her cigarette. "Don't pay attention to it," she finally said, her voice dismissive, but her eyes held a strange, knowing glint. Is just the building settling? Is very old building? The conversation was clearly over. I left her apartment feeling more unsettled than before. Her denial was too quick, too absolute. Confirmed my fears rather than alleviated them. That night, the activity escalated. The scratching became bolder, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster. I pressed my ear to the wall again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the building's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards. It was primal, ancient, like nothing I had ever heard. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead. I couldn't stay in my apartment. Not another minute. Grabbing my keys and phone, I fled into the dimly lit hallway, the faint glow of emergency lights doing little to dispel the gloom. The hallway itself felt different. The air was heavier, colder, the scent of decay stronger here. The light from my phone seemed to struggle against the oppressive darkness, barely illuminating the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet. As I walked, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, I noticed something new. On the wall opposite my apartment door, etched faintly into the peeling paint, were a series of symbols. They were the same swirling, intricate designs I had seen in that ancient book in the library, the ones that had haunted my dreams since that night. My blood ran cold, a wave of nausea washing over me. This wasn't just my apartment. This was connected. I hurried down the 5 flights of stairs, the chanting growing louder as I descended, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. The stairwell was a vortex of cold, dank air. As I reached the ground floor, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. The main lobby, usually lit by a single weak bulb, was bathed in an eerie, pulsing red light. It flickered erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls. And then I saw the source. The ancient, heavy wooden door to the building's basement was ajar, a sliver of the pulsing red light escaping from within. From that gaping darkness, the smell of decay was overpowering, thick and cloying, making me gag. And the chanting, now a deafening crescendo, was clearly coming from below. It wasn't just chanting anymore. It was a frantic, desperate chorus of voices, layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. Yet its tone was unmistakably one of supplication and terror. My legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. Every rational fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run out the main door, to never look back. But the sight of those symbols, the chilling implication that this wasn't just my building, but part of a larger, darker tapestry, held me captive. I had to know. I had to see. Slowly, hesitantly, I pushed the basement door open further. The red light pulsed more intensely, bathing the descending steps in a hellish glow. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing liquid, a suffocating mixture of decay, ozone, and something else. Something distinctly metallic, like rust and old blood. The chanting was deafening, a relentless assault on my sanity, twisting my thoughts, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. I began to descend the creaking, wooden stairs, each step a descent into an ever-deepening abyss of horror. The walls of the stairwell were slick with condensation, gleaming in the pulsing red light. As I went deeper, the temperature plummeted, the chill so profound it felt like needles piercing my skin. The scratching I had heard in my apartment seemed to echo from every direction, multiplied 1,000-fold, as if countless unseen entities were tearing at the very fabric of the building. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow, unlit corridor stretched into the darkness. The red light pulsed from a vast, open chamber at its end. I edged forward, my hands scraping against the rough, damp brick wall. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, almost spongy. And then I saw them, faint, dark streaks on the floor, leading towards the red light. They looked like drag marks. The chanting in the chamber swelled, rising and falling in terrifying waves. It was no longer just voices. There were other sounds mixed in. A wet, tearing noise, a soft, squelching sound, and then a low, guttural growl, deep and ancient, that vibrated through the very ground. I reached the entrance to the chamber and stopped, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes wide with disbelief and unspeakable terror. The room was immense, its true size obscured by the pulsing red light and shifting shadows. In the center, on a raised, crudely constructed stone slab, was what looked like a massive dark mass. It pulsed with the same unsettling rhythm as the red light, its surface glistening wetly. From it, thin, almost translucent tendrils snaked outwards, disappearing into the shadows. And kneeling around the slab, their bodies contorted into unnatural angles, their faces obscured by the pulsing light and self-inflicted wounds, were a dozen or so figures. They were chanting, their voices raw and desperate, their hands raised towards the pulsating mass. They were dressed in tattered, archaic clothing, their skin pale and almost translucent. As the red light pulsed, I saw glimpses of something utterly horrifying. Their eyes were not human. They were black, vacant pools, reflecting only the infernal glow. And their mouths were stretched open unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. The smell of decay was overwhelming, mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood and something else, something fetid and unholy. Strewn across the floor around the slab were discarded bones, dark stains, and scattered personal effects. A tarnished locket, a child's worn shoe, a broken pair of spectacles. One of the figures, thinner and more gaunt than the others, suddenly rose. Its head snapped towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. It let out a piercing, unearthly shriek that ripped through the oppressive air, a sound of pure agony and malevolence. The other figures stopped their chanting, their heads slowly, synchronously turning towards me, their black, empty eyes fixed on me, a silent, predatory gaze that promised unspeakable torment. The pulsating mass on the slab seemed to throb faster, its tendrils quivering. My mind fractured. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. My legs, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly found a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. I turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, back towards the stairs, the shrieks of the figures echoing behind me, joined by the sickening sound of their bare feet pounding on the stone floor, gaining on me. I scrambled up the steps, 3 at a time, my lungs burning, the cold, damp air tearing at my throat. The chanting resumed below me, now frantic, furious, mixed with the terrifying growl of the entity on the slab. The red light pulsed through the cracks in the door, painting the stairwell in shifting hues of hell. I could feel their presence behind me, the cold, stale breath of death on my neck. I burst out into the dimly lit lobby, gasping, shaking uncontrollably. The main door of the Oak Haven, the heavy, imposing oak door that usually required a key, was now standing slightly ajar, a sliver of glorious, mundane street light peeking through. It was an invitation, a promise of escape. I threw myself against the door, pushing it open with a desperate surge of strength, and stumbled out onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. The cool night air hit me like a revelation, washing over my sweat-soaked skin. The distant sounds of the city, the honking cabs, the chatter of late-night revelers, were a symphony of normalcy, a lifeline back to sanity. I didn't look back. I just ran, never stopping, never pausing, until the crumbling brick facade of the Oak Haven was a distant, horrifying memory. I never returned to the Oak Haven. I abandoned all my belongings, my designs, my entire life within those walls. The cheap rent had come at an unspeakable price. To this day, the faintest hint of metallic decay, the softest scratching sound, or the most innocuous red light sends a bolt of ice through my veins. Sometimes, when the night is utterly silent, I still hear the distant, reedy giggle or the ancient guttural chanting, and I know with a chilling certainty that the Oak Haven isn't just an old apartment building. It's a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. and I was just one more offering in its long, hungry history. The sticky floor of the Grand Illusion Cinema was a familiar comfort, a minor trade-off for the promise of escapism. Elias sank into the plush, crimson seat of Auditorium 3, the faint smell of stale popcorn and cheap disinfectant filling his nostrils. It was a Tuesday night, late, and the movie was an indie horror flick called The Static, a low-budget psychological thriller that promised more dread than jump scares. Perfect. Around him, the auditorium was sparsely populated. A couple huddled in the back row, their hushed whispers barely audible. A lone figure sat 5 rows ahead, perfectly still. A scatter of others dotted the vast, empty space, each an island in the dim pre-show light. The air was cool, almost too cool, a subtle chill that raised the tiny hairs on Elias's arms. He shrugged it off. Old cinema, probably an ancient AC unit. The trailers flickered across the screen, a parade of explosions and dramatic pronouncements. Elias checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The main feature was about to begin. He leaned back, anticipating the familiar plunge into darkness. The lights dimmed, not with the usual slow fade, but with an abrupt, almost violent click. The emergency exit signs, usually a soft green glow, seemed to pulse with an unsettling intensity. The screen flared to life, not with the opening credits of The Static, but with a sudden, jarring burst of white noise. It was deafening, a raw, abrasive hiss that vibrated through the seats, making Elias's teeth ache. Then the white noise cut out, plunging the auditorium into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The screen remained a blank, shimmering white. A low, guttural groan rippled through the audience, not from the speakers, but from the actual people around him. Elias frowned, confused. Was this part of the movie? An immersive sound design? A woman a few rows ahead shifted uneasily. Her chair creaked, a loud, grating sound in the unnatural quiet. Then the screen flickered and a single grainy image appeared. A close-up of a human eye. It was wide, bloodshot, and filled with an unbearable terror. The image pulsed, almost imperceptibly, to the rhythm of a slow, deliberate tapping that now echoed through the theater. Top, top, top? It wasn't coming from the screen. It was coming from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from behind the seats. Panic began to coil in Elias's gut. This wasn't The Static. This wasn't any movie he knew. The eye on the screen dilated, its pupil shrinking to a pinprick, then expanding grotesquely. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then a whisper, thin and reedy, slithered from the speakers, barely audible beneath the persistent taps. "Can you see me?" A collective gasp swept through the audience. A few people stirred, whispering nervously. "What the hell is this?" someone muttered. Suddenly, the screen went black again, but not completely. A faint, shimmering outline appeared, like heat haze, at the very center of the blank screen. It began to grow, taking on a vague, humanoid form. As it expanded, the air in the auditorium plummeted in temperature. Elias shivered violently, the cold seeping into his bones, a damp, clinging chill that felt entirely unnatural. And with the cold came a new, unsettling smell. A faint, cloying sweetness, like dried roses left too long in a forgotten vase, mixed with something distinctly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. The whispering from the speakers grew louder, now accompanied by a faint, desperate whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. "I see you. I hear you." The shimmering form on the screen solidified, becoming a darker, more defined shadow. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to pulsate with a faint, internal light, like embers under skin. His head tilted as if listening. A man in the front row stood up abruptly, his chair clattering to the floor. "This isn't funny," he yelled, his voice cracking with fear. He started towards the exit door, his footsteps echoing too loudly. The moment he took a step, the emergency exit signs, which had been pulsing, began to flash violently, strobe-like, bathing the auditorium in sickening green light. The tapping intensified to a frantic, furious drum. And from the speakers, the whispers converged, twisting into a chorus of low, guttural chanting, primal and ancient. A sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up into Elias's very core. The man stumbled, clutching his head, then collapsed to the ground, writhing. From the shadows beneath his seat, thin, almost translucent tendrils snaked out, wrapping around his ankles, pulling him back into the darkness between the seats. His screams were abruptly cut short. The audience erupted. People began to shriek, scrambling from their seats, pushing and shoving towards the emergency exits. But the doors, which had moments ago seemed perfectly normal, were now glowing with that same sickly green light, and they wouldn't budge. They were stuck, sealed. The shadowy entity on the screen had grown larger, its form now filling almost the entire frame. Its head was indistinct, but two pinpricks of red light flared where eyes should be, fixed on the terrified audience. A woman near Elias tried to climb over the seats, desperate. As her hand touched the velvet fabric, the seat itself seemed to ripple, and a wave of the cloying, sweet smell washed over her. She recoiled, gagging, then screamed as unseen forces pulled her down into the dark chasm between the rows. Her terrified shriek turned into a gurgling sound, then silence. The tapping was now coming from inside the seats, from under the floor. The auditorium was alive, a monstrous maw. Elias felt a cold brush against his ankle, a sensation like damp, coarse hair. He gasped, kicking wildly, scrambling over the armrests, trying to reach the aisle. The screen pulsed, the red eyes of the entity narrowing, as if in amusement. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, a chorus of agony and dark purpose. He saw the couple from the back row. The man was frantically pulling at the exit door, his face streaked with tears. The woman beside him began to sink into her seat, as if consumed by the plush velvet, her arms flailing, a silent scream frozen on her face. Elias reached the aisle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the cold touch again, reaching for him. He spun around, seeing nothing but the swirling shadows under the seats, the glint of something wet and dark. He knew. It wasn't just the entity on the screen. It was the cinema itself. The seats, the floor, the walls, they were all part of it, a living, hungry thing. He lunged for the main entrance, pushing against the heavy double doors with all his might. They creaked, groaned, but wouldn't open. The green exit signs flashed malevolently. The air was thick with the scent of decay and that unholy sweetness. The entity on the screen seemed to lean forward, its red eyes blazing. Then, from the speakers, the reedy giggle returned, closer now, directly overhead. And it was joined by another sound, one that chilled Elias to his very core. The unmistakable crunching of bones. He pounded on the doors, screaming, his voice raw. The theater was no longer an escape. It was a trap, and they were the main feature. The projector light flickered, illuminating the horrifying reality. The empty seats around him, not just empty, but indented, as if something had sunk into them, leaving dark, wet stains on the crimson fabric. The faint, metallic smell was stronger now, undeniably the scent of fresh blood. He turned, his eyes wide and unblinking, as the shadowy tendrils began to emerge from the seats around him, writhing, reaching. The red eyes on the screen pulsed, a predatory gleam. The entity wasn't just on the screen. It was everywhere, and it was hungry. The final scream caught in his throat as the darkness rushed in. The night shift at the old Grand Central Library wasn't for the faint of heart. Not because of the work. Shelving dusty tomes and organizing forgotten microfiches was mind-numbingly dull, but because of the silence. It wasn't the gentle quiet of a sleeping city. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. I, Arthur, the lone overnight attendant, knew every creak of the ancient building, every groan of settling timbers, every whisper of air through its vast, empty halls. But tonight there was a new sound. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the towering fiction section. where forgotten classics slept in their leather-bound husks.
Top, top, top.
Like a branch against a window pane, but there were no windows in the interior stacks. My first thought was a loose pipe, a tremor in the old plumbing, but the sound was too precise, too deliberate. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the comforting weight of a first edition of Moby Dick in my hands. But the tapping persisted, growing infinitesimally louder, more insistent. My heart began to thump a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pulled out my phone, its screen a tiny, defiant beacon in the gloom, and activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the dusty air, illuminating rows upon rows of silent books, their spines a kaleidoscope of muted colors. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the vastness of the space. Only the tapping answered, now accompanied by a faint, paper-thin rustle, like pages turning. I told myself it was just old Mrs. Henderson, the eccentric librarian, who sometimes forgot her keys and tried to sneak back in after hours. But Mrs. Henderson was 86 and moved like molasses. The sound was quick, nimble. I walked slowly down the aisle, the beam of my flashlight dancing across titles, each one seemingly staring back at me with unblinking eyes. The tapping led me deeper into the labyrinthine stacks, past forgotten encyclopedias and obscure academic journals, the air growing colder with each step, carrying with it a faint, musty scent, like old paper and something else, something dry and brittle. Then I saw it. At the end of a long, narrow aisle, tucked between shelves of antiquated history books, a single book lay open on a reading stand. It was a massive, leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed and brittle, emblazoned with strange, swirling symbols I didn't recognize. The tapping was coming from it, a tiny, insect-like sound against the pages. And the rustling, that was the pages slowly, steadily turning themselves. My breath hitched. My mind screamed at me to run, to sprint for the emergency exit. But the sight held me, a chilling fascination. The book continued to turn its own pages, each one accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, a dry, raspy sound that seemed to emanate from the very paper itself. It wasn't words I could understand, but a jumble of ancient tongues, a cacophony of lost knowledge and forgotten curses. As I stared, horrified, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom behind the shelves. It was impossibly thin, a mere wisp of darkness, yet it seemed to coalesce, to gain substance, as it drifted towards the open book. It was draped in what looked like the remnants of a librarian's uniform, faded and shredded, but it was not human. Its movements were too fluid, too unnatural. A sudden, sharp creak echoed from the main reading room, a sound that usually meant the building was settling. But this was different. This was the sound of a heavy, wooden chair being dragged across the polished floor. And then another and another, a growing chorus of scraping, as if an invisible audience was assembling. The tapping intensified, frantic now, like 1,000 tiny fingers drumming on a coffin lid. The whispers from the book grew louder, forming a discordant chorus that pressed against my eardrums. The air grew thick with the musty, brittle scent, now mingled with something acrid, like ozone after a lightning strike. And from the corner of my eye, I saw them, shadows, just like the one by the book, slipping out from between the stacks, from under the reading tables, from the darkest corners of the library. They were not solid, yet they seemed to shimmer with an inner malevolence, their forms indistinct, constantly shifting. One of the shadows drifted closer to the open book, hovering over it like a vulture over carrion. The tapping reached a crescendo, and then, with a final, sickening snap, the book slammed shut. The whispers died instantly, replaced by a profound, echoing silence, even deeper than before. But the scraping of chairs continued, now joined by a low, guttural groan that seemed to resonate from the very foundations of the building. The shadows began to converge, slowly, deliberately, forming a semicircle around me. I could feel their collective gaze, cold and ancient, pressing down on me. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly, painting chaotic streaks of light across the dust-laden shelves. In the fleeting flashes, I saw fleeting glimpses of their faces, or what passed for them. Hollowed-out voids, dark pits where eyes should have been, stretched mouths that seemed to gasp for something not quite air. My breath caught in my throat. My legs, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly found their strength. I turned and ran, not towards the exit, but deeper into the library, a desperate, irrational dash for the children's section, as if the brightly colored picture books could somehow protect me. But the library had shifted. The familiar aisles twisted and turned, morphing into endless corridors of silent, watchful books. The scraping of chairs followed me, closer now, a relentless, rhythmic pursuit. I could feel the cold breath of the shadows on my neck, their formless presence brushing against my arms, raising goosebumps. The musty, acrid smell filled my lungs. I stumbled into what should have been the grand reading room, but it was not. It was a vast, circular chamber, its walls lined not with books, but with countless empty wooden chairs, arranged in concentric circles, all facing a central dais. And on the dais, illuminated by a single flickering gas lamp that materialized from nowhere, was the large, leather-bound book. It was open again, its pages rustling, its symbols glowing faintly, and seated in every single chair, filling the immense room with their silent presence, were the shadows. Hundreds of them, their indistinct forms all facing the book, all facing me. Their collective stillness was more terrifying than any roar. The groaning intensified, a chorus of deep, ancient sounds that seemed to come from the very ground beneath my feet. From the dais, the shadow that had been by the book slowly, gracefully, rose. It extended a long, skeletal finger towards me, and a single, clear word echoed in my mind, not spoken aloud, but impressed directly into my thoughts. Read. The musty air pressed in on me, suffocating. I felt an irresistible urge, a compulsion I couldn't fight, to walk towards the book, to pick it up, to understand the whispers that had haunted me. My feet moved on their own accord, heavy, unwilling, yet utterly determined. I could feel the silent, expectant gaze of the shadows, hundreds of ancient eyes piercing through me. As I reached the dais, the flickering gas lamp suddenly flared, casting stark, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted the forms of the seated specters. I saw the book, its pages wide open, the strange symbols twisting and writhing like living things. And just as my hand reached out, a deafening, piercing scream tore through the silence of the library. It was the wail of 100 souls in agony, the shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. The scream wasn't mine, it was the library's. And then, just as quickly as it began, it ended. The gas lamp winked out. The shadows vanished. The book was gone. The chairs were gone. The strange chamber dissolved into the familiar grand reading room, dark and utterly silent. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile what I had seen with the mundane reality of the library. It was 4:30 a.m. My shift would be over soon. I dragged myself up, my muscles aching, my throat raw. I stumbled towards the main exit, not daring to look back, not daring to believe it was over. The automatic doors hissed open, spitting me out into the cool, pre-dawn air. The city was still asleep, oblivious to the horrors that unfolded within its quiet corners. I never returned to Grand Central Library. The memory of the tapping, the turning pages, the sweet, acrid smell, and the silent, waiting shadows never truly left me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint rustle of pages, and I instinctively check the nearest bookshelf, half expecting to see an ancient, leather-bound volume open itself, waiting for me to read. And I know with a chilling certainty that the library isn't just a place of books. It's a place of something far older, far darker, and infinitely more hungry. The air in Willow Creek had always been thick with unspoken tensions, a quiet hum beneath the surface of polite smiles and shared potlucks. But when the Great Divide truly began, it wasn't a sudden explosion. but a slow, insidious rot, seeping into every crack of the community. Sarah Vance, a woman whose roots in this land ran as deep as the ancient oaks, felt it keenly. Her conservatism wasn't just a political stance. It was a way of life, a reverence for tradition, for self-reliance, for the unyielding principles she believed had built this nation. The men who now held sway in Willow Creek, a new wave of urban transplants with their progressive ideals and their disdain for the old ways, saw her as an anachronism, a relic to be swept aside. It started subtly. Disagreements at town meetings turned into heated arguments. Fences were erected not just around properties, but around ideologies. Then came the re-education initiatives, the mandatory community workshops on inclusive thought, the quiet shunning of those who didn't conform. Sarah, with her sharp mind and sharper tongue, became a symbol of resistance, a thorn in their collective side. She refused to attend their workshops, refused to change her views, refused to be silenced. The night the power grid failed, a strange, unnatural darkness descended upon Willow Creek, not just from the lack of electricity, but from a deeper, more primal fear. The news reports, crackling faintly on battery-powered radios, spoke of widespread outages, of civil unrest in the cities, of a nation teetering on the brink. Here, in the isolated valley, it felt like the end of the world. The men of the New Order, as they now called themselves, saw it as an opportunity. Led by a charismatic, self-proclaimed philosopher named Marcus Thorne, they began to consolidate power. They seized the town hall, the general store, and the meager supply of emergency generators. Their rhetoric, once veiled, became overt. Those who resisted their vision of a harmonious, progressive society would be dealt with. Sarah knew what that meant. She had seen the glint in Marcus's eyes, the fanaticism that had replaced reason. She had prepared. Her small, isolated farm, nestled deep in the woods, was a fortress of her own making. She had stocked provisions, sharpened her hunting knives, and, most importantly, cleaned and loaded the old Winchester rifle her grandfather had left her. She wasn't just a conservative woman. She was a survivor, forged in the crucible of hard work and an unshakable belief in her right to exist on her own terms. The first knock came on the third night of darkness. It was a soft, insistent rap on her sturdy oak door. Sarah stood in the shadows of her living room, the Winchester cradled in her arms, its cold steel a comforting weight. Through a crack in the curtains, she saw them, 3 men, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Marcus Thorne was among them, his lean frame radiating an unsettling confidence. Sarah, Marcus's voice, amplified by the stillness of the night, carried an unnerving calm. "We know you're in there. Come out. It's time to join the community. For your own good." Sarah remained silent. She knew their community was a cage, their good a euphemism for submission. "Don't be foolish." Another voice, harsher, cut in. "We have ways of making you see reason." A chill snaked down Sarah's spine, but it wasn't fear. It was a cold, resolute anger. She had fought for her beliefs her entire life, and she wasn't about to surrender them to these self-appointed tyrants. "This is my home," she called out, her voice steady, betraying none of the tension coiling within her. "And I will defend it." A moment of silence, then Marcus's soft chuckle. "As you wish, Sarah. But understand, the old ways are dead. Progress demands sacrifice." The men retreated into the shadows. Sarah knew they wouldn't leave. They would return, and they would be less polite. She spent the night patrolling her property, the crunch of leaves under her boots the only sound in the oppressive darkness. Her senses were heightened. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sending a jolt through her. She was a hunter now, and the hunted. The real assault began at dawn. They came from the woods, a dozen of them, their faces grim, their movements coordinated. They carried crude weapons, axes, clubs, even a few rusty pitchforks. Marcus, standing at the edge of the tree line, held a megaphone. "Sarah Vance!" His voice boomed, distorted and menacing. "This is your final warning. Surrender now, and we will be lenient. Sarah raised the Winchester, aiming it at the sky, and fired a single shot. The crack echoed through the valley, a defiant roar against their threats. Marcus's face hardened. Then you have chosen your fate. He gestured, and the men surged forward. Sarah had anticipated this. She had dug shallow trenches, laid out tripwires, and strategically placed thorny bushes around her property. The first few men stumbled, caught in her traps, their shouts of surprise quickly turning to curses of pain. She picked off 2 more with well-aimed shots, not to kill, but to wound, to sow chaos and fear. The men, disoriented, hesitated. They had expected an easy victory, a quick subjugation of an old woman. They hadn't expected resistance, let alone such calculated defiance. Marcus, enraged, bellowed orders, pushing them forward. Don't falter. She's just one woman. But Sarah was more than just one woman. She was the embodiment of everything they sought to erase. Resilience, independence, the fierce spirit of a free individual. She moved with a practiced grace, darting between cover, her rifle spitting fire, her movements economical and precise. She was a veteran in her own right, a warrior in a different kind of war. One man, a burly brute named Kevin, managed to breach her outer defenses. He charged towards her, an axe raised high. Sarah waited, her eyes cold and focused. As he closed the distance, she dropped to one knee, aimed and fired. The bullet struck him in the leg, sending him sprawling with a howl of pain. The battle raged for hours. Sarah, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperate ferocity. She used the terrain to her advantage, disappearing into the dense foliage, reappearing in unexpected places, her shots forcing them back, keeping them off balance. She was a phantom, a whisper in the wind, a nightmare for those who sought to control her. As the day wore on, the men grew frustrated, their initial confidence replaced by exhaustion and fear. They had lost several of their own, either wounded or too demoralized to continue. Marcus, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes burning with a desperate fury, realized he had underestimated her. He called for a retreat. The remaining men, battered and defeated, stumbled back into the woods, leaving behind a trail of blood and broken pride. Sarah watched them go, her chest heaving, the acrid smell of gunpowder clinging to the air. She had won the first battle, but she knew it wasn't over. Marcus Thorne was not a man who accepted defeat. Days turned into a tense standoff. Sarah remained vigilant, her farm a silent island in a sea of hostility. She saw their patrols, heard their distant shouts, felt their constant surveillance. They were trying to starve her out, to break her will through isolation. But Sarah Vance's will was not easily broken. She had lived through droughts, blizzards, and personal tragedies. This was just another challenge. She rationed her supplies, hunted small game in the woods, and tended to her small garden, a defiant act of normalcy in a world gone mad. One night, the whispers began again, not the spectral kind, but the real ones carried on the wind. She heard them, faint at first, then growing louder, the voices of women. They were coming from the direction of the town. Curiosity, a dangerous emotion, gnawed at her. She grabbed her rifle, a small pack, and slipped out into the darkness. She moved through the woods like a shadow, her senses alert. She found them at the edge of Willow Creek, a group of women huddled together, their faces pale and drawn in the faint moonlight. They were the wives and daughters of the men who had attacked her, women who had been forced to endure Marcus Thorne's new order. They were whispering, their voices filled with fear and desperation. Sarah listened, hidden in the shadows. They spoke of forced labor, of meager rations, of their men becoming increasingly brutal and paranoid. They spoke of their children being taken to re-education camps in the old schoolhouse. They spoke of a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan to escape, to fight back. One woman, a timid librarian named Martha, spoke with a newfound courage. "We can't live like this anymore. We have to do something." Sarah Vance. She fought them. She showed us it's possible. A spark ignited within Sarah. She wasn't alone. Her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for them, for the soul of Willow Creek. She revealed herself, stepping out of the shadows. The women gasped, startled. Then their fear turned to awe. "I can help you," Sarah said, her voice low and firm. "But it will be dangerous. Are you willing to fight?" A murmur went through the group, then a chorus of determined nods. They were tired of living in fear. They were ready to fight. Sarah led them back to her farm, a silent procession of rebellion. She taught them what she knew: how to move silently through the woods, how to set simple traps, how to use makeshift weapons. She showed them how to load and aim the rifle, though she kept it for herself, knowing its power was too great for untrained hands. She instilled in them a sense of purpose, a belief in their own strength. The plan was simple, audacious, and terrifying. They would strike at dawn, when the men were least expecting it. They would target the town hall, where Marcus Thorne and his inner circle slept, and the schoolhouse, where the children were held. The night before the attack was filled with a nervous energy. Sarah sharpened her knives, her mind clear, her resolve unyielding. She looked at the faces of the women around her, some young, some old, all united by a common enemy. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about survival, about freedom, about reclaiming their lives. The attack was swift and brutal. Sarah, leading the charge, moved like a ghost through the pre-dawn gloom. She disabled the sentries with practiced ease, her knife finding its mark with chilling precision. The other women, emboldened by her example, moved with a newfound courage, their improvised weapons striking true. They burst into the town hall, catching Marcus Thorne and his men by surprise. The fight was chaotic, a desperate struggle in the flickering light of lanterns. Sarah, her rifle blazing, engaged Marcus directly. He was a fanatic, but he was also a coward, his philosophical pronouncements crumbling in the face of real violence. He lunged at her, a desperate, wild swing with a heavy club. Sarah dodged, her movements fluid, and brought the butt of her rifle crashing down on his head. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Meanwhile, the other women, fueled by years of suppressed rage, overwhelmed the remaining men. The fight was messy, brutal, but ultimately decisive. The men of the New Order were defeated, their reign of terror brought to an end by the very people they had sought to control. At the schoolhouse, the women found their children, terrified but unharmed. The reunion was tearful, a mix of relief and lingering trauma. As the sun rose over Willow Creek, casting long, golden rays over the quiet valley, Sarah stood amidst the wreckage, her face grim but resolute. The battle was won, but the war for their community, for their way of life, had just begun. There would be rebuilding, healing, and the difficult task of forging a new path forward, one built on genuine community, not forced conformity. Sarah Vance, the conservative woman who had fought liberal men to the death, had not just defended her home. She had sparked a revolution, a quiet uprising in the heart of a forgotten valley. She had shown them that true freedom was not given, but earned, sometimes with blood, always with an unyielding spirit. And as the people of Willow Creek began to pick up the pieces, they knew that the echoes of her defiance would resonate through the valley for generations to come, a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked ideology and the enduring power of a woman who refused to be silenced. The scars of the conflict would remain, etched into the landscape and the souls of those who lived through it, a testament to the dark side of division and the terrifying lengths to which humans can go when their beliefs clash. The quiet hum of tension in Willow Creek had been replaced by a fragile peace, a peace born of fire and blood, forever haunted by the specter of what had almost been lost. The needle was a familiar friend, a silver serpent whispering promises of oblivion. Liam traced its cold length with a trembling finger, his reflection in the spoon a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger. The apartment was a tomb, its air thick with stale smoke and the stench of his own neglect. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light that pierced the grimy window, each one a tiny, mocking specter. The only sound was the ragged wheeze of his own breath, a constant reminder of the life he was slowly suffocating. He'd started with pills, a gentle descent into the numb embrace of forgetfulness after his sister, Sarah, died. The grief had been a physical weight, crushing him, pushing him towards any escape. Then came the harder stuff, chasing a deeper silence, a void that promised to swallow the gnawing guilt and the phantom echoes of her laughter. He remembered Sarah, vibrant and full of life, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Now those memories were blurred, distorted by the haze, replaced by a constant, dull ache that only the needle could momentarily soothe. But the void was fighting back, pushing at the edges of his sanity, demanding more than just his peace. It began subtly, a flicker in his peripheral vision, a shadow that wasn't there, gone the moment he turned his head. The creak of floorboards when he was alone, a rhythmic groan that seemed to follow him from room to room. The faint, sweet scent of lilies, Sarah's favorite flower, that would suddenly permeate the stale air. So real he could almost taste the pollen, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind the lingering stench of his squalor. He dismissed it as withdrawal, the cruel tricks his mind played when starved of its chemical comfort, the desperate cries of a body in revolt. But then the whispers started, soft, insistent, just beyond the threshold of audibility. They were like static on an old radio, just a hair's breadth from forming coherent words. He'd strained to hear them, his head cocked, his breath held, his bloodshot eyes darting around the empty room. Sometimes it sounded like his name, a faint, drawn-out Liam. A mournful sigh carried on an unseen breeze. Other times it was a fragmented sentence, a plea, a warning, a jumble of syllables that made his skin crawl. He'd clutch his head, digging his fingers into his scalp, trying to shake them off, convinced he was finally losing it, that the drugs had finally eaten away at the last vestiges of his mind. One night, as he prepared his fix, the whispers coalesced into a distinct voice. Sarah's voice. "Don't, Liam," it pleaded, clear as a bell, yet ethereal, as if spoken from a great distance, from a place beyond the living. He dropped the spoon, the clatter echoing unnaturally loud in the silent room, a sound that seemed to shatter the oppressive quiet. His hands shook, not from the familiar tremors of withdrawal, but from a cold, creeping dread that seeped into his very bones. He hadn't seen her face in years, not clearly, not without the haze of drugs. His memories of her were fractured, like a broken mirror. But now, in the dim, sickly light of his living room, a translucent form shimmered by the doorway, coalescing from the shadows. It was Sarah, or what looked like her. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, filled with a vibrant spark, were now hollow, dark pools, filled with an unbearable sorrow that mirrored his own. Her skin was a ghostly white, almost phosphorescent, and her long, dark hair seemed to ripple like smoke, swaying in an unseen current. "You're not real," he croaked, his voice a dry, rasping sound, scrambling backward, knocking over a stack of empty takeout containers that clattered across the stained carpet. "You're a hallucination, just a bad trip, a nightmare." He squeezed his eyes shut, willing her away, willing the terror to dissipate. The figure didn't speak again, but its eyes, those sorrowful, empty eyes, seemed to bore into his very soul, pinning him in place. It raised a spectral hand, translucent and shimmering, pointing a translucent finger towards the needle on the floor, glinting malevolently in the dim light. A silent accusation heavier than any words. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound torn from the depths of his chest, and stumbled into his bedroom, slamming the door shut with a resounding thud that vibrated through the flimsy walls. He pressed his back against it, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stayed there for what felt like hours, rigid with fear, listening, waiting for a sound, a whisper, anything. The apartment remained silent, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence, pregnant with unseen horrors. The next morning, the terror had faded, replaced by a dull ache in his limbs and a desperate, gnawing craving that screamed for satisfaction. He convinced himself it had been a dream, a vivid nightmare brought on by his addiction, a cruel trick of his deprived mind. He needed to get high, to silence the lingering fear, to push Sarah's ghostly image back into the recesses of his mind where she belonged, a painful memory, not a terrifying apparition. But the encounters grew more frequent, more vivid, more insistent. Sarah appeared in his kitchen, watching him with those mournful eyes as he rummaged for food, her silent presence a judgment. She stood by his bed at night, a spectral sentinel, her silent presence a suffocating weight that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The scent of lilies became constant, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his very skin, a floral shroud that never left him. He could taste it in the air, a cloying sweetness that made his stomach churn. He tried to ignore her, to push through the fear, to find solace in the drug, to chase the fleeting moments of oblivion. But the drugs no longer worked as they once did. The high was fleeting, tainted by her spectral presence, by the cold dread that now accompanied every shot. He'd shoot up, and she'd be there, a silent witness to his self-destruction, her sorrowful gaze a constant torment, a mirror reflecting his own shame. He started talking to her, at first in angry outbursts, his voice hoarse with frustration. "What do you want from me, Sarah? Leave me alone. You're dead. Go back to where you came from." Then, his anger would dissolve into desperate pleas, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. "Please, just leave me alone. I can't take this anymore." Her voice, when it came, was a whisper that seemed to echo from inside his own head, a chilling resonance that bypassed his ears and settled directly in his brain. "You brought me back, Liam. You opened the door." He stared at her, horrified, his mind struggling to grasp her meaning. "What do you mean? I didn't do anything. I just wanted to forget. The path you walk," her spectral voice continued, growing stronger, more defined, yet still imbued with an otherworldly quality. "It thins the veil between worlds, calls to what lies beyond. You are not alone in this apartment, Liam. I am not the only one you have invited into your despair." A new, colder dread settled over him, a creeping realization that made his blood run cold. He looked around the squalid apartment, suddenly aware of the oppressive silence, the heavy air that seemed to press down on him from all sides. He had always felt alone here, isolated in his self-made prison, but now, a chilling certainty gripped him. He wasn't. He was a host. The scratching returned, not from within the walls, but from beneath the floorboards, a faint, scuttling sound, like insects, but larger, heavier, accompanied by a soft, wet slithering. He saw shadows shift in the corners of his vision, faster, more defined than before, solidifying into grotesque, fleeting forms. The air grew colder, the scent of decay mingling with the cloying lilies, a sickening combination that made him gag. Sarah's form began to flicker, her edges blurring, as if something was pulling at her, distorting her, tearing at her spectral essence. Her eyes widened in terror, reflecting the growing horror in the room. "They're here, Liam," she whispered, her voice strained, barely audible above the rising cacophony of unseen movement. "The others, you fed them, you called them with your pain, with your surrender." He looked at his arm, at the track marks, the bruised veins, the evidence of his addiction. He had been feeding something, all right, feeding his addiction, feeding his despair. But what else had he been feeding? What monstrous entities had he inadvertently invited into his sanctuary of self-destruction? The scratching intensified, coming from all directions, a chorus of unseen claws scraping against wood and plaster. The shadows in the corners began to stretch, to elongate, forming indistinct, monstrous shapes that pulsed with a malevolent energy. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floor, a sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the building, from the earth itself. Liam stumbled back, his eyes darting wildly, his breath catching in his throat. He saw them now, not just shadows, but forms, shifting and writhing in the gloom, coalescing from the oppressive darkness. They were amorphous, vaguely humanoid, their limbs too long, their bodies too thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes, when they caught the dim light, glowed with a malevolent, hungry red, like embers in a dying fire, fixed on him with an insatiable desire. "What are they?" he whimpered, clutching his head, his fingers digging into his scalp, trying to make the nightmare stop. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now, fading, distorted, as if she were being pulled away by an unseen force. "They are the hunger, Liam, the things that feed on despair, on weakness, on the broken. You opened the door with your pain, with your escape, and they poured through. They want to consume you, just as you consumed yourself." One of the creatures detached itself from the wall, slithering towards him with unnatural speed. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form rippling like smoke, its limbs extending and retracting with sickening clicks. He could feel its cold, predatory gaze, a hunger that went beyond physical sustenance, a desire to devour his very soul, his last shred of hope. He backed away, tripping over a pile of clothes, falling to the floor with a painful thud. The creature loomed over him, its form coalescing into something vaguely resembling a skeletal hand reaching out, its fingers long and bony, tipped with razor-sharp talons. He could feel its icy breath on his face, a chilling gust that carried the stench of ancient decay, of death and forgotten things, filling his nostrils, making him gag. Sarah's fading image flickered beside him, her hand reaching out, not to him, but towards the needle still lying on the floor, a glint of silver in the oppressive darkness. The dagger, Liam, her voice, almost gone now, a mere echo in his mind. The only true key, break it. He looked at the needle, then at the monstrous hand reaching for him, its shadow falling over his face. A desperate, terrifying realization dawned. The dagger wasn't a weapon to fight the creatures. It was the tool of his destruction, the very thing that had opened the door to this nightmare. To close it, to banish these horrors, he had to sever the connection, destroy the conduit. With a surge of adrenaline, a desperate, primal instinct for survival, he lunged for the needle, not to use it, but to break it. The creature shrieked, a sound that grated on his very soul, a high-pitched, unearthly wail, and recoiled, its form flickering, momentarily weakened by his defiance. He grabbed the needle, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it, and snapped it in half against the edge of the table. The plastic cracked with a sharp report, a sound of finality, and the metal bent, rendering it useless, a broken symbol of his shattered past. The moment the needle broke, a wave of pure agony washed over him. It was as if 1,000 tiny claws were tearing at his insides, ripping away at his very being, consuming him from within. The creatures shrieked again, their forms writhing, shrinking, their malevolent glow dimming. The red in their eyes faded, replaced by a dull, lifeless gray. Sarah's image solidified for a moment, a faint, sad smile on her lips, a look of peace finally gracing her spectral features. "You closed it, Liam," she whispered, her voice clear, strong, and full of a love he hadn't felt in years. Then she dissolved into motes of light, fading completely, leaving behind only the faint, lingering scent of lilies, a final, bittersweet farewell. The pain was excruciating, a searing fire in his veins, every nerve screaming in protest. But beneath it, a strange sense of clarity began to emerge. The fog of the drugs was lifting, replaced by a raw, unfiltered reality. He was seeing the apartment and himself, for the first time in years, not through a haze, but with stark, brutal honesty. The creatures, weakened by the severing of their connection, recoiled further, melting back into the shadows, their forms growing indistinct once more, dissolving into nothingness. The scratching faded, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible hiss, like air escaping a punctured tire. The scent of decay lingered, a reminder of what had been, but the lilies were gone, replaced by the clean, crisp smell of nothing. Liam lay on the floor, gasping, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, his body trembling uncontrollably. The withdrawal was hitting him with full force, a brutal, relentless assault on his body and mind, a storm of nausea, cramps, and an unbearable craving. But through the pain, he felt something else, a flicker of hope, a desperate, fragile resolve that had been dormant for too long. He had faced the monsters he had invited, the literal and metaphorical demons of his addiction, and he had, for the first time in a long time, fought back. The apartment was still a mess, his life still in ruins, but the veil had lifted. He saw the horror, but he also saw the path out of it. A narrow, treacherous path, but a path nonetheless. The road ahead would be long, filled with unimaginable pain and overwhelming cravings, a constant battle against the insidious whispers of relapse. The shadows might still linger, whispering at the edges of his perception, tempting him back into the numb embrace of oblivion, but he knew now what they were, and he knew he had the power to keep the door closed, to resist their call. He pushed himself up, his limbs trembling, his body screaming in protest with every movement. He staggered to the window, forcing it open with a grunt. A gust of fresh, clean air rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and distant city life, a breath of the world he had abandoned. He leaned against the frame, taking deep, shuddering breaths, letting the cold air fill his lungs, cleansing him, pushing out the stale, toxic air of his past. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a new dawn breaking over the city. The light, though still weak, felt like a beacon, a promise of a new beginning. He was still in the gilded cage of his addiction, but a tiny crack had appeared, a sliver of escape, a glimpse of freedom. He had to fight, not just the monsters in the shadows, but the monster within himself, the insidious craving that had almost consumed him. And for the first time in a very long time, Liam felt a flicker of courage, a spark of resilience. The veiled reality was terrifying, but at least now he could see it. And seeing it was the first step towards truly living again, towards a life free from the shadows and the endless hunger. The air in the imperial harem was thick with the scent of jasmine and despair. Alara, the newest addition to the Emperor's collection of beauties, felt it cling to her skin like a shroud, heavier than the silken robes she was forced to wear. Her days were a tapestry of enforced idleness and simmering dread, each thread woven with the whispers of forgotten concubines and the chill that permeated even the sunniest courtyards. She had arrived at the Crimson Palace barely a moon ago, plucked from her humble village like a fragile wildflower. The Emperor, a man whose eyes held the cold gleam of polished obsidian, had chosen her for her unusual silver hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He saw not a woman, but an ornament, another jewel to adorn his vast, silent empire. The other concubines, a kaleidoscope of beauty from across the lands, were a study in resignation. Their laughter, when it came, was brittle, like glass shattering. Their smiles never reached their eyes, which held a haunted, distant look. They spoke in hushed tones of the others, those who had come before and simply vanished, not dismissed, not sent home, but gone, leaving only the lingering scent of their perfumes and the echo of their names in the empty chambers. Alara tried to dismiss it as palace intrigue, the cruel machinations of women vying for a tyrant's fleeting attention. But the silence was too profound, the fear too palpable. The palace itself seemed to breathe, its ancient stones groaning with unseen burdens. At night, when the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across her chamber, Alara would hear it, a faint, rhythmic scratching from within the walls, like tiny claws seeking purchase. She'd press her ear to the cool stone, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the sound would always cease the moment she focused on it, leaving only the oppressive quiet. One evening, concubine Lyra, a woman whose beauty was as striking as her wit, failed to appear for the Emperor's evening repast. A ripple of unease spread through the harem. The servants, usually so meticulously efficient, moved with a new, almost frantic energy, their eyes darting nervously. When questioned, they offered vague answers, speaking of a sudden illness, a journey home. But Alara had seen Lyra that morning, vibrant and full of life, her laughter echoing through the bathing chambers. That night, the scratching returned, louder this time, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible moan. It seemed to come from the wall directly behind her bed. Alara huddled beneath her silken covers, tears silently tracing paths down her temples. She imagined Lyra trapped, scratching, moaning. The thought was absurd, yet it clung to her, a chilling whisper in the dark. Days bled into weeks. More concubines disappeared. First, the fiery-haired Zara, then the quiet, scholarly May. Each absence deepened the pall over the harem, turning the once vibrant chambers into a mausoleum of whispered fears. The emperor, oblivious or uncaring, continued his routine, his gaze as cold and unreadable as ever. Alara began to explore, driven by a desperate need to understand. She wandered the labyrinthine corridors when the guards were lax, her bare feet silent on the polished marble. She found forgotten wings, dust-laden and filled with the ghosts of past lives. In one such wing, she stumbled upon a small, unassuming door, almost hidden behind a tapestry depicting a hunt. The tapestry itself was faded, its colors muted by time, but the scene was unsettling. A stag, cornered and terrified, its eyes wide with primal fear, surrounded by faceless hunters. The door was unlocked. It led to a narrow, winding staircase, descending into absolute darkness. A faint, metallic scent, like old blood and rust, wafted up. Every instinct screamed at Alara to turn back, but a morbid curiosity, a desperate hope for answers, propelled her forward. She lit a small oil lamp she had secretly taken from a servant's cart, its feeble flame barely pushing back the encroaching shadows. The stairs ended in a damp, stone-walled corridor. The air grew colder, heavier, filled with the scent of decay. The scratching sound was clearer here, a frantic, desperate rhythm. It was coming from behind a heavy, iron-bound door at the end of the corridor. The door was ancient, its surface pitted and scarred, and a single rusted padlock hung from a thick chain. As Alara approached, the scratching intensified, accompanied by a low, guttural whimpering. Her breath hitched in her throat. She pressed her ear to the cold iron, and what she heard sent a jolt of pure terror through her. It was not a human voice, not exactly. It was a distorted, animalistic sound, a desperate plea that twisted her stomach into knots. And beneath it, a faint, familiar scent, jasmine. Lyra's perfume. Alara recoiled, her lamp shaking in her trembling hand. She wanted to flee, to forget what she had heard, but the image of Lyra's vibrant face, now twisted into that monstrous sound, held her captive. She noticed something else then, something glinting in the dim light near the bottom of the door. A small, tarnished silver earring, shaped like a crescent moon. It was Zara's. A new, horrifying realization dawned on her. The disappearances weren't dismissals or illnesses. They were something else, something unspeakable. Over the next few days, Alara became obsessed. She spent her nights poring over ancient texts in the palace library, bribing old servants with stolen trinkets for forgotten lore. She learned of the emperor's ancestors, of a dark pact made centuries ago to ensure the prosperity and power of the imperial line. A pact that demanded tribute. The scratching grew louder each night, more insistent. It was no longer just behind her wall. It seemed to resonate from every stone in the palace. She saw shadows move in her peripheral vision, felt cold breaths on her neck when no one was near. Her sleep was plagued by vivid, grotesque nightmares, twisted faces, elongated limbs, eyes that glowed with malevolent hunger in the dark. One moonless night, Alara felt a presence in her room. She lay rigid in her bed, her eyes squeezed shut, listening to the soft, wet dragging sound approaching her. The scent of decay was overwhelming now, mingling with the sweet, cloying jasmine. A cold, clammy touch brushed her cheek. She stifled a scream, her body paralyzed by terror. When she finally dared to open her eyes, the room was empty. But on her pillow, where her head had rested moments before, lay a single silver hair, long and fine, just like her own. It was a warning. She was next. Desperation fueled her. She knew she couldn't escape the palace, not with its high walls and vigilant guards. Her only hope was to confront the horror, to understand it, perhaps even to destroy it. She remembered the old servant, a wizened woman named Anya, who had given her cryptic warnings about the hunger beneath the throne. Alara sought out Anya, finding her hunched over a brazier in the servants' quarters. Anya's eyes, rheumy with age, held a deep, ancient sorrow. Alara pleaded with her, begging for the truth. Anya finally spoke, her voice a raspy whisper. The Emperor's line, "It is not blessed by the heavens, child. It is cursed by the earth. A beast, ancient and hungry, slumbers beneath this palace. It feeds on beauty, on youth, on life itself. In exchange, it grants the Emperor his power, his longevity, his dominion." Alara listened, horrified, as Anya described the ritual. Every few months, when the beast stirred, a concubine was chosen, not by the Emperor, but by the beast itself, through subtle signs and whispers that only the most attuned could perceive. The chosen one was then led to the hidden chamber, not to be killed, but to be transformed, twisted into a grotesque parody of their former selves. Their life force slowly drained to sustain the creature, their beauty devoured, leaving only a husk of agony. "They become part of it," Anya whispered, her voice trembling. "Their essence, their suffering fuels its power. The scratching you hear, it is their pleas, their attempts to escape the prison of its flesh. The jasmine, it is the last scent of their humanity, clinging to the air before it is consumed." Alara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This wasn't just death. It was something far worse, a living nightmare. Anya then revealed a secret, a desperate hope. The beast is bound by iron and shadows, but its power is not absolute. There is a weakness, a single ancient dagger, forged by the first emperor's own hands, imbued with the light of a dying star. It is hidden within the emperor's private vault, guarded by spells and traps. Only it can sever the beast's connection to its victims, perhaps even destroy it. The task seemed impossible. The Emperor's vault was impenetrable, but Alara had no other choice. She began to plan, her mind racing with desperate strategies. She would use her position, her perceived innocence, to get close to the Emperor. The next day, she was summoned to the Emperor's private chambers. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm, to project an aura of serene compliance. The Emperor regarded her with his usual detached gaze. He spoke of trivial matters, of the upcoming harvest festival, of a new poem he had commissioned. Alara listened, feigning interest, her mind focused on the vault. She noticed a small, intricately carved wooden box on his desk, its surface gleaming with polished gold. It was a puzzle box, a common imperial pastime. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice soft and deferential, "that is a most exquisite piece. I have always been fascinated by such mechanisms." The Emperor, perhaps surprised by her sudden interest, offered it to her. "It is a trifle. Can you solve it, concubine?" Alara took the box, her fingers tracing its delicate carvings. She had always possessed a knack for puzzles, a keen eye for patterns. As she manipulated the hidden latches and sliding panels, her mind worked furiously. She needed a reason to be in the vault, a way to distract him. "It is truly a marvel," she said, feigning frustration. Perhaps if I had a quiet moment, away from the distractions of the harem, I might unravel its secrets. A place where I could truly focus, Your Majesty." The Emperor considered her, a flicker of something akin to amusement in his cold eyes. "Indeed, my private study, then. It is quiet, and the vault is nearby. You may use it tonight." Alara's heart leaped. It was a gamble, but it had paid off. That night, under the pretense of solving the puzzle box, Alara found herself in the Emperor's study. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and power. The vault, a massive iron door adorned with intricate carvings, dominated one wall. She worked on the puzzle box, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. After an hour, the box clicked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single shimmering key, not for the vault, but for a smaller, hidden drawer within the Emperor's desk. Alara's fingers trembled as she opened the drawer. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. It was the Emperor's personal diary, filled with his cold, meticulous script. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning for any mention of the vault, of the beast. She found it. A passage describing the vault's opening mechanism, a complex sequence of pressure plates and rotating symbols, all tied to a specific astrological alignment. And then, a chilling detail, the dagger, the only true key, rests within. Its light repels the shadow, its edge severs the bond. Alara memorized the sequence, her mind racing. She then turned her attention to the vault door. The symbols were etched into its surface, waiting to be aligned. She worked quickly, her movements precise, her fear momentarily forgotten in the adrenaline of the moment. With a soft click, the massive iron door swung inward, revealing a small, circular chamber. The air within was still and cold, charged with an ancient energy. In the center, on a pedestal of black marble, lay the dagger. It was unlike any blade she had ever seen. Its hilt was crafted from dark, polished wood, and its blade, though seemingly made of ordinary steel, pulsed with a faint, ethereal blue light. It hummed with a low, resonant vibration, a living thing. As she reached for it, a sudden chill swept through the chamber. The shadows deepened, twisting into grotesque forms. A low growl, deep and resonant, echoed from the walls. The beast knew. Alara snatched the dagger, its hilt warm against her palm. The blue light intensified, pushing back the encroaching darkness. She turned, her eyes scanning the chamber. Nothing, but the growl was closer now, a wet, slithering sound. She fled the study, the dagger clutched tightly in her hand, its light guiding her through the darkened corridors. The scratching was deafening now, a cacophony of desperate cries and guttural snarls. The very walls seemed to writhe, their stone surfaces rippling like disturbed water. She raced towards the hidden staircase, the one leading to the iron-bound door. She had to free them or at least end their suffering. As she descended the winding stairs, the air grew thick with the stench of decay and the overwhelming sweetness of jasmine. The whimpering from behind the iron door was louder, more desperate. Alara reached the door, her hand trembling as she raised the dagger. The blue light of the blade pulsed, illuminating the rusted padlock. She brought the dagger down, not against the lock, but against the ancient pitted surface of the door itself. Where the blade touched, the iron hissed, and a black, viscous ichor oozed from the metal, evaporating into foul-smelling smoke. The scratching inside intensified, a frantic, desperate crescendo. Then, with a sickening crack, the iron door began to buckle inward. A gaping maw, dripping with black slime, appeared in the center of the door, as if the metal itself were melting. From within the opening, a grotesque hand emerged, long and skeletal, its fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws. It was followed by another, and then a face, a distorted, elongated visage, its eyes sunken and hollow, its mouth stretched into a silent scream. It was Lyra, or what was left of her. Her once beautiful features twisted into a mask of pure agony. Behind her, Alara saw other forms, shadowy and indistinct, writhing in the darkness. Zara, May, and countless others. Their bodies fused together, their limbs intertwined, their faces contorted in silent horror. They were a living, breathing tapestry of suffering, bound to the beast. The creature, the true form of the horror, began to pull itself through the opening. It was a monstrous amalgamation of flesh and bone, a pulsating mass of limbs and eyes, its surface slick with the black ichor. It had no discernible shape, only a horrifying fluidity, constantly shifting and reforming. Its gaze, a multitude of eyes, fixed on Alara. A low, vibrating hum filled the chamber, a sound that threatened to tear her mind apart. It was a sound of ancient hunger, of insatiable desire. Alara knew she couldn't fight it directly. The dagger was not for combat but for severing. She raised the blade, its blue light blazing, and plunged it into the pulsating mass of the creature. There was no scream, no roar, only a deafening silence, followed by a sound like tearing fabric, a wet, ripping noise that echoed through the chamber. The blue light flared, engulfing the creature. The forms of the concubines, fused within its flesh, seemed to shimmer, their distorted faces momentarily regaining a semblance of their former beauty before dissolving into motes of light. The beast convulsed, its amorphous body thrashing, sending sprays of black ichor across the stone walls. The scratching ceased. The whimpering died away. The overwhelming scent of jasmine faded, replaced by the clean, crisp scent of ozone. Then, with a final, shuddering tremor, the creature collapsed inward, its monstrous form shrinking, dissolving, until nothing remained but a small, shimmering puddle of black liquid on the stone floor. The iron door, now free of its grotesque burden, swung fully open, revealing only empty darkness beyond. Alara stood panting, the dagger heavy in her hand, its blue light slowly dimming. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of her own breathing. She had done it. She had severed the connection, freed the tormented souls. But the horror was not entirely gone. The palace still held its secrets. Its ancient stones still whispered of the darkness that had once resided within. The emperor, she knew, would eventually discover what she had done. His power, his longevity had been tied to the beast. Now that bond was broken. Alara emerged from the hidden passage, the dagger still clutched in her hand. The palace was quiet, unnaturally so. The servants were asleep, the guards patrolling their rounds, oblivious to the cataclysm that had just occurred beneath their feet. She made her way back to her chamber, her body aching, her mind reeling. She looked at her reflection in a polished silver mirror. Her silver hair seemed to shine brighter. Her winter sky eyes held a new, fierce light. She was no longer just a concubine, a fragile wildflower. She was a survivor, a liberator. The next morning, the emperor was found in his private chambers, still and cold. His obsidian eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, a look of profound terror etched onto his face. His skin, once unnaturally smooth, was now wrinkled and sallow, as if decades had been added to his life in a single night. His power, his life force, had drained away with the beast. The palace was in an uproar. The guards, the eunuchs, the remaining concubines, all were in a state of bewildered chaos. Alara watched from her window, a strange sense of calm settling over her. She knew she couldn't stay. The palace, even without the beast, was a gilded cage, a monument to a forgotten horror. She would leave, disappear into the vast lands beyond the Crimson Palace, a ghost among the living. As she slipped away in the pre-dawn hours, disguised in a servant's simple tunic, she carried nothing but the ancient dagger, its blue light now a faint, almost imperceptible glow. It was a reminder of the darkness she had faced, and the light she had found within herself. The whispers of the vanished concubines would forever echo in the halls of the Crimson Palace, a chilling tale of beauty devoured and souls imprisoned. But now, among those whispers, there would also be a new one, a faint, hopeful murmur, the tale of the silver-haired concubine who dared to defy the darkness and lived to tell the tale. A tale that would fade into legend, a warning against the true cost of power and the horrors that lurk beneath the surface of even the most beautiful facades. The gilded cage was broken, but its shadows would forever linger. Sir Kalen, Knight of the Obsidian Order, felt the chill of the castle stones seep into his bones, a cold more profound than the winter winds howling through the crenellated towers of Castle Blackwood. His armor, once a gleaming testament to his unwavering loyalty, now felt like a leaden shroud, each rivet a burden. King Theron, once a beacon of justice and strength, had become a shadow of his former self, consumed by a darkness that seeped from the very heart of his reign. It had begun subtly, a creeping malaise that first touched the outer villages, then the market towns, and finally, the very halls of the keep. A wasting sickness, the healers called it, but Kalen knew better. The victims didn't merely sicken. They withered, their flesh decaying even as they lived, their eyes hollowed by a terror that transcended mere pain. And always, always, the scent of carrion followed them, a cloying sweetness that clung to the air like a shroud. The king, too, began to change. His once booming laugh became a dry cough. His regal bearing slumped into a perpetual stoop. His skin, once ruddy with health, took on a pallid, almost translucent quality. But it was his eyes that truly terrified Kalen. They were no longer the piercing blue of a wise ruler, but a murky, shifting gray, devoid of warmth, reflecting only a cold, ancient hunger. He began to keep to his chambers, emerging only for council meetings, where his pronouncements grew increasingly erratic, his decrees laced with a chilling indifference to human suffering. Whispers spread through the castle like a contagion. Tales of dark rituals performed in the deepest dungeons, of strange, unholy pacts made in the dead of night. The royal physician, a kind old man named Master Alara, had vanished without a trace after voicing concerns about the king's declining health and increasingly peculiar habits. His disappearance only fueled the dread. Kalen, bound by his oath to the crown, tried to dismiss the rumors as peasant superstitions, but the evidence mounted. The castle guards, once proud and vigilant, became gaunt, their faces etched with a profound weariness, their eyes darting nervously into the shadows. Supplies dwindled, not from siege, but from an unseen drain. The granaries, once overflowing, were now half empty, their contents untouched, yet somehow diminished. One moonless night, Kalen was on patrol along the battlements. The wind howled, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic scraping sound from below, like rusted metal dragging on stone. He peered over the edge, his hand on the hilt of his sword, but saw nothing but the swirling darkness. Yet, the sound persisted, growing louder, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the castle. It was not human. He followed the sound, descending through winding staircases, deeper and deeper into the castle's forgotten levels. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay that now permeated everything, mingled with a new, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit. The scraping led him to a heavy, iron-bound door, deep within the oldest section of the dungeons, a part of the castle rumored to be sealed for centuries. The sound was deafening here, a frantic, desperate rhythm, punctuated by the chilling moans. Kalen pressed his ear to the cold iron. What he heard sent a jolt of pure terror through him. It was a chorus of whimpers, of choked cries, and a horrifying, wet slurping sound. He recoiled, his hand trembling as he drew his sword. The door was not locked, merely sealed with ancient, rusted bolts. He forced them open, the screech of metal echoing through the oppressive silence that followed. The chamber beyond was a nightmare. It was vast, damp, and lit by a sickly green glow emanating from strange, pulsating growths on the walls. In the center, a massive, amorphous mass of dark, glistening flesh pulsed rhythmically. It was covered in hundreds of mouths, each one a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth, constantly opening and closing, slurping at something unseen. And from within the depths of the mass, Kalen could discern faint, distorted forms, human forms, their limbs twisted, their faces contorted in silent agony, their bodies slowly dissolving into the pulsating horror. His stomach churned, and he almost vomited into his helmet. The scent of carrion was overwhelming here, mixed with the sickeningly sweet smell of decay. He saw a familiar face, half submerged in the pulsating mass, its eyes wide with an unspeakable terror. Master Alara, the royal physician. His body was half consumed, his arms still reaching out, as if in a desperate plea for help. Kalen stumbled back, his mind reeling. This was the source of the sickness, the drain on the castle. This was what the king had become bound to. This was the true horror. He fled the chamber, slamming the iron door shut, the sounds of the slurping and moaning echoing in his ears. He raced back through the labyrinthine passages, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had to tell someone. But who? The guards were compromised, the court terrified into silence. Over the next few days, Kalen became a ghost within the castle walls. He spent his nights poring over ancient texts in the forbidden section of the royal library, bribing old scribes with what little coin he had left. He learned of a forgotten lineage of kings, of a dark pact made centuries ago to ensure eternal dominion over the lands. A pact that demanded tribute. Not gold, not armies, but life itself. The creature in the dungeon, the text described, was an ancient entity, a parasitic being from the abyssal plains, drawn to realms tainted by ambition and despair. It fed on the life force of living beings, slowly consuming them, transforming them into part of its own grotesque form. In return, it granted immense power and unnatural longevity to its host, the king. The king, the texts revealed, was not merely sick. He was becoming one with the entity, his body slowly merging with its vile essence. The more he fed it, the stronger it became, and the more he gained in power, but at the cost of his humanity, his very soul. The wasting sickness in the villages was merely the overflow, the entity's tendrils reaching out, draining life from the surrounding lands. Kalen's sleep was plagued by vivid, grotesque nightmares. The king's face, distorted and monstrous, merging with the pulsating mass, his eyes glowing with the same sickly green light. He felt the cold, clammy touch of unseen tendrils brushing against his skin, heard the slurping sounds in the deepest recesses of his mind. One morning, he was summoned to the king's private audience chamber. The air was thick with the scent of decay, stronger than ever. King Theron sat on his throne, his form almost skeletal, his skin stretched taut over his bones. His eyes, the murky gray pools, seemed to glow with an inner malevolent light. "Sir Kalen," the king rasped, his voice a dry, papery whisper, yet resonating with an unnatural power. "You have been inquisitive. You seek truths best left buried." Kalen knelt, his hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his sword. "Your Majesty, the kingdom withers. The people suffer. This darkness must be purged." The king let out a sound that was not a laugh, but a dry, rattling cough that seemed to tear at his throat. "Purged? Foolish knight. This is power. This is eternity. The kingdom will thrive, fed by the very essence of its people. A small price for endless dominion." As he spoke, the king's form seemed to shimmer, his skin rippling, his eyes glowing brighter. Kalen saw it then, a faint, almost transparent tendril of black, glistening flesh extending from beneath the king's robes, retracting quickly back into the shadows beneath the throne. "You have seen it, haven't you?" the king whispered, his voice laced with a chilling amusement. "The heart of my power, and soon you too shall be part of it. A loyal servant, even in death." Kalen knew then that there was no reasoning with him. The king was gone, replaced by something ancient and monstrous. His only hope was to find a way to destroy the entity, to sever its connection to the crown. He remembered a vague reference in the old texts to a blade of pure light, capable of piercing the veil between worlds and severing unholy bonds. It was said to be hidden in the catacombs beneath the old chapel, guarded by ancient wards. He feigned compliance, his face a mask of grim determination. "As you command, your Majesty, I shall serve." That night, Kalen slipped into the ancient chapel, its stained glass windows depicting saints now shattered, their colors muted by time and grime. He descended into the catacombs, the air growing colder, heavier, filled with the scent of damp earth and forgotten bones. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water from the ceiling. He navigated the maze of crypts, his torch casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, revealing skeletal remains resting in their ancient tombs. He searched for the wards, for any sign of the blade. He found it beneath a crumbling altar, hidden behind a false wall, a small, unassuming chamber, its entrance sealed by a shimmering, ethereal barrier. He pressed his hand against the barrier, and a jolt of pure energy coursed through him, pushing him back. The wards were powerful. He remembered a passage in the texts, a riddle describing the key to breaking the wards. The tears of the innocent, the blood of the loyal, and the whispered prayer of a forgotten saint. Kalen knew what he had to do. He pricked his finger, letting a drop of his own blood, the blood of a loyal knight, fall onto the shimmering barrier. Then he remembered the whispered prayer of Saint Alaric, a forgotten patron saint of purity, a prayer he had learned as a child. He recited it, his voice barely a whisper in the echoing silence. The barrier pulsed, then dissolved into motes of light, revealing a small pedestal within the chamber. And upon it, resting on a cushion of ancient velvet, was the blade. It was not a sword, but a dagger, its hilt crafted from pure, unblemished silver, its blade a shimmering ethereal blue, pulsating with an inner light. It hummed with a low, resonant vibration, a living thing, radiating a warmth that pushed back the oppressive chill. As Kalen reached for it, the catacombs shuddered. A low, guttural growl echoed from the depths, closer than before. The entity knew. He snatched the dagger, its hilt warm against his palm. The blue light intensified, pushing back the encroaching shadows. He raced back through the catacombs, the dagger's light guiding him. The growl was closer now, a wet, slithering sound, accompanied by the familiar slurping. He emerged from the chapel, the dagger clutched tightly in his hand, its light blazing. The castle was alive with unnatural sounds. The scraping, the moaning, the slurping. It was coming from everywhere, from within the walls, from beneath the floor. The very stones seemed to writhe, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. He raced towards the dungeon, towards the iron-bound door. He had to sever the connection, to destroy the source of the horror. As he descended the winding stairs, the air grew thick with the stench of decay and the overwhelming, sickly sweet smell. The moaning from behind the iron door was louder, more desperate, a symphony of suffering. Kalen reached the door, his hand trembling as he raised the dagger. The blue light of the blade pulsed, illuminating the ancient, rusted iron. He brought the dagger down, not against the door, but against the very air in front of it, as if striking an invisible barrier. Where the blade touched, the air shimmered, and a black, viscous ichor oozed from the unseen wound, evaporating into foul-smelling smoke. The sounds inside intensified, a frantic, desperate crescendo of whimpers and snarls. Then, with a sickening crack, the iron door began to buckle inward, as if pushed by an immense, unseen force. A gaping maw, dripping with black slime, appeared in the center of the door, as if the metal itself were melting. From within the opening, a grotesque hand emerged, long and skeletal, its fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws. It was followed by another, and then a face, a distorted, elongated visage, its eyes sunken and hollow, its mouth stretched into a silent scream. It was Master Alara, or what was left of him, his once kind features twisted into a mask of pure agony. Behind him, Kalen saw other forms, shadowy and indistinct, writhing in the darkness. Guards, servants, villagers, countless others. Their bodies fused together, their limbs intertwined, their faces contorted in silent horror. They were a living, breathing tapestry of suffering, bound to the entity. The creature, the true form of the horror, began to pull itself through the opening. It was a monstrous amalgamation of flesh and bone, a pulsating mass of limbs and eyes, its surface slick with the black ichor. It had no discernible shape, only a horrifying fluidity, constantly shifting and reforming, extruding pseudopods and mouths. Its gaze, a multitude of eyes, fixed on Kalen. A low, vibrating hum filled the chamber, a sound that threatened to tear his mind apart. It was a sound of ancient hunger, of insatiable desire, of untold suffering. Kalen knew he couldn't fight it directly. The dagger was not for combat, but for severing. He raised the blade, its blue light blazing, and plunged it into the pulsating mass of the creature, aiming for its perceived core. There was no scream, no roar, only a deafening silence, followed by a sound like tearing fabric, a wet, ripping noise that echoed through the chamber. The blue light flared, engulfing the creature. The forms of the consumed, fused within its flesh, seemed to shimmer, their distorted faces momentarily regaining a semblance of their former selves before dissolving into motes of light, finally freed. The entity convulsed, its amorphous body thrashing, sending sprays of black ichor across the stone walls. The slurping ceased, the moaning died away. The overwhelming scent of decay faded, replaced by the clean, crisp scent of ozone. Then, with a final, shuddering tremor, the creature collapsed inward, its monstrous form shrinking, dissolving, until nothing remained but a small, shimmering puddle of black liquid on the stone floor. The iron door, now free of its grotesque burden, swung fully open, revealing only empty darkness beyond. Kalen stood panting, the dagger heavy in his hand, its blue light slowly dimming. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing. He had done it. He had severed the connection, freed the tormented souls. But the horror was not entirely gone. The castle still held its secrets. Its ancient stones still whispered of the darkness that had once resided within. The king, he knew, would eventually discover what he had done. His power, his unnatural longevity had been tied to the beast. Now that bond was broken. Kalen emerged from the dungeon, the dagger still clutched in his hand. The castle was quiet, unnaturally so. The guards were patrolling their rounds, their faces still gaunt, their eyes still holding a hint of the terror they had endured, oblivious to the cataclysm that had just occurred beneath their feet. He made his way back to the king's audience chamber, his body aching, his mind reeling. He found King Theron still on his throne, but his form was now utterly withered, a mere husk of a man. His skin was translucent, almost skeletal, and his eyes, once pools of murky gray, were now empty, lifeless sockets. His crown, the symbol of his power, lay askew on his head, a circlet of carrion. His power, his life force, had drained away with the beast. The castle was in an uproar. The few remaining loyal courtiers, the servants, all were in a state of bewildered chaos. Kalen watched, a strange sense of calm settling over him. He knew he couldn't stay. The castle, even without the entity, was a monument to a forgotten horror, a place tainted by unimaginable suffering. He would leave, disappear into the vast lands beyond Blackwood, a ghost among the living, carrying the weight of what he had witnessed. As he slipped away in the pre-dawn hours, disguised in a simple traveler's cloak, he carried nothing but the ancient dagger, its blue light now a faint, almost imperceptible glow. It was a reminder of the darkness he had faced, and the terrible truth he had uncovered. The whispers of the consumed would forever echo in the halls of Castle Blackwood, a chilling tale of a kingdom devoured and a king corrupted. But now, among those whispers, there would also be a new one, a faint, hopeful murmur, the tale of the knight who dared to defy the darkness and lived to tell the tale. A tale that would fade into legend, a warning against the true cost of power and the horrors that lurk beneath the surface of even the most regal facades. The crown of Carrion had fallen, but its shadows would forever linger. The city of Viridia was a labyrinth of shadowed alleys and towering, rain-slicked spires, a place where secrets were currency and death, a profession. Its neon glow, a false promise of vibrancy, merely highlighted the deeper, pervasive gloom. Elias Vance, known only as the Wraith in the hushed whispers of the underworld, was its most sought-after practitioner. He moved like smoke, leaving no trace, his victims often unaware of their demise until the cold embrace of oblivion claimed them. His tools were silence, precision, and an unnerving ability to blend into the urban tapestry, becoming just another shadow among countless shadows, an unseen predator in a concrete jungle. Elias lived in a forgotten attic apartment, high above the city's ceaseless hum, a solitary eyrie from which he observed the world. His sanctuary was stark, minimalist, reflecting his own existence. A cot, a small table, a meticulously organized array of blades, each one a work of deadly art, and a single unadorned window overlooking the sprawling, indifferent metropolis. He preferred the quiet solitude, the rhythmic drip of rain on the skylight, the distant wail of sirens that never quite reached his elevated haven. He was a creature of habit, his days and nights a carefully orchestrated dance of rigorous physical training, exhaustive surveillance, and the chilling execution of contracts. His mind, as sharp and honed as his blades, was a fortress against emotion, a necessary defense in his line of work. His current target was a reclusive industrialist named Kalen Thorne, rumored to possess a ledger detailing the city's most illicit dealings, a document that could unravel the very fabric of Viridia's power structure. The contract was simple: retrieve the ledger, eliminate Thorne. Elias had spent weeks observing Thorne's fortified penthouse, a monolithic structure that seemed to pierce the very clouds. He had meticulously mapped out every security detail, every guard patrol, every potential entry and exit point, every flaw in the seemingly impenetrable defense. He was a master of planning, leaving absolutely nothing to chance. His success built on an obsessive attention to detail. The night of the assassination was a symphony of wind and rain, a perfect cloak for his movements. The storm raged, lashing against the skyscraper's glass and steel, muffling the distant city sounds. Elias scaled the sheer face of Thorne's skyscraper, his specialized gear biting into the wet stone, each grapple and ascent a testament to years of training. His breath was a controlled whisper in the howling gale, his heart a steady drum against his ribs. He moved with a dancer's grace, each movement economical, precise, a shadow against the storm-swept sky. He breached the penthouse's reinforced windows, the high-tech locking mechanisms yielding silently to his touch, slipping inside like a phantom, leaving no trace of his intrusion. The penthouse was a mausoleum of immense wealth, filled with dark, polished with that gleamed dully in the ambient light, priceless artifacts from forgotten civilizations, and an oppressive, almost suffocating silence that swallowed every sound. Elias moved through it, his senses heightened, every nerve alive, attuned to the slightest anomaly. He bypassed laser grids that crisscrossed hallways like invisible spiderwebs, pressure plates hidden beneath opulent rugs, and motion sensors disguised as decorative elements, all with practiced ease and an almost instinctual understanding of their weaknesses. He found Thorne in his study, a cavernous room lined with ancient, leather-bound books and intricate, hand-drawn maps of long-lost territories. Thorne was hunched over a massive mahogany desk, a single, flickering oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls, giving the room an unsettling, almost theatrical quality. The infamous ledger lay open before him, its pages filled with dense, arcane script. Elias raised his blade, a sliver of moonlight filtering through a break in the clouds, glinting off its razor edge, a silent promise of oblivion. He moved behind Thorne, silent as a breath, a predator closing in on its unsuspecting prey. But just as the blade began its descent, a mere whisper from its target, Thorne spoke, his voice a low, raspy murmur that seemed to fill the vast room, resonating in the very air. "I've been expecting you, Wraith." Elias froze, his blade suspended inches from Thorne's neck. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. No one knew his moniker, not truly. He was a ghost, a myth, a whisper on the wind. Thorne slowly turned, his movements deliberate, unhurried, his eyes, dark and knowing, fixed on Elias with an unnerving intensity. There was no fear in them, only a chilling resignation, and something else, a profound, ancient weariness, as if he had witnessed countless cycles of life and death. "You're not the first," Thorne continued, his gaze drifting past Elias, towards the shadowed corners of the study, as if addressing unseen presences. "They always send more. They always think they can take what is mine, but they never learn." His voice was devoid of malice, merely stating a fact, a truth etched into the very fabric of this place. A cold dread, unfamiliar and unsettling, prickled at Elias's skin, a sensation that crawled up his spine. He was the hunter, not the hunted. He was the one who instilled fear, who commanded the shadows. Yet, in Thorn's presence, he felt a strange, primal unease, a sense of being utterly outmatched, exposed. "The ledger," Elias stated, his voice flat, professional, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Where is it?" Thorn chuckled, a dry, rattling sound, like brittle leaves skittering across stone. "The ledger is merely bait, wraith, a lure for those who seek to control what cannot be controlled, a whisper of power that draws the greedy, the ambitious, the foolish." He gestured vaguely at the room, a sweeping motion that encompassed the oppressive shadows. "They are here, always here, watching, waiting." Elias's eyes narrowed, scanning the deeper recesses of the room. He was alone in the room with Thorn. He had checked. He scanned the shadows again, his hand tightening on his blade, his senses screaming at him that something was profoundly wrong. "Who?" he demanded, his voice edged with a growing suspicion. "The others?" Thorn whispered, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible level, a conspiratorial murmur. "The ones who came before. The ones who failed. The ones who thought they could take what was not theirs." A faint chill permeated the air, colder than the night's rain. A sudden drop in temperature that made Elias's breath mist. He felt a subtle shift in the shadows, a fleeting impression of movement at the edge of his vision, like a ripple in still water. He dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the light, the strain of his long vigil. He had been awake for days, meticulously planning this, and his mind was undoubtedly playing tricks on him. He lunged, his blade a silver blur, a desperate attempt to break the unsettling spell Thorn had cast. Thorn made no move to defend himself, merely watched with those unnerving, knowing eyes, a faint, almost pitying smile on his lips. The blade sliced through the air, a whisper of steel, but just before it connected, a sudden, invisible force slammed into Elias, a shockwave of pure, raw energy. He was thrown across the room with brutal force, hitting a heavy bookshelf with a jarring, bone-rattling thud, books raining down around him like a cascade of ancient knowledge. He scrambled to his feet, disoriented but miraculously unharmed, his mind reeling. Thorn was still sitting at his desk, perfectly composed, a faint, melancholic smile on his lips, as if he had anticipated every move. "They protect me," Thorn said, his voice now imbued with a strange, resonant quality, a deep hum that vibrated in Elias's chest. "They have for a very long time, for centuries perhaps, and they are displeased with your intrusion, displeased with your intent." The shadows in the room deepened, coalescing into vague, humanoid forms, not solid, but undeniably present. Elias saw them now, not clearly, but as distortions in the air, shimmering outlines that seemed to absorb the ambient light, drawing it into their spectral forms. They were silent, utterly still, yet their presence was overwhelming, radiating an ancient, malevolent cold that seeped into his very bones, a profound sense of despair and forgotten rage. "What are you?" Elias demanded, his voice hoarse, his carefully cultivated composure finally cracking, revealing the raw fear beneath. "The echoes?" Thorn replied, his smile widening, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous, glinting like shards of obsidian in the dim lamplight. "The echoes of those who sought to take what was not theirs. The echoes of assassins. Your predecessors, wraith. Your brothers in ambition and failure." Elias realized with a sickening jolt of horror, a cold wave washing over him, that Thorn wasn't protected by living guards, by flesh and blood. He was protected by the spectral remnants of every assassin who had ever failed to kill him. Their failed attempts, their final agonizing moments, had somehow bound them to this place, to Thorn, becoming his eternal spectral guardians, an invisible, unholy army. A chilling whisper, dry and rustling, filled the room, seeming to come from all directions at once, a chorus of spectral voices. "He is one of us now. He will join us. He will serve. One of the shadowy forms detached itself from the wall, drifting towards Elias with an unnatural, gliding motion. It was vaguely human-shaped, but distorted, its limbs elongated, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if permanently broken. Elias felt a sudden, inexplicable coldness in his right hand, the hand holding his blade. He looked down. His fingers were turning translucent, shimmering like heat haze, becoming insubstantial. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized him, a primal scream trapped in his throat. He tried to move, to run, to escape this living nightmare, but his legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot, held by an unseen force. The shadowy form reached him, its ethereal hand passing through his own, a sensation of profound, agonizing cold. A jolt of unimaginable pain shot through him, a sensation of his very essence being drained, pulled away, unraveling like a frayed thread. He screamed, a sound that was instantly muffled, absorbed by the oppressive silence of the room, by the hungry whispers of the echoes. He felt himself dissolving, his physical form becoming less substantial, his vision blurring, the edges of the room melting into a swirling vortex of shadow. He saw Thorn, still smiling, still watching, his eyes reflecting the growing horror in Elias's own, a silent witness to his damnation. The whispers intensified, a chorus of dry, rustling voices, growing louder, more insistent, filling his fading consciousness. Join us, become one of us, protect the Master, forever. Elias fought, a desperate, futile struggle against an unseen force, against the inevitable. He tried to lash out, to strike, to sever the invisible bonds that were pulling him apart, but his blade passed through the shadowy forms as if they were made of smoke, useless against the incorporeal. His body continued to fade, his senses dimming, the world around him receding into a gray haze. He felt the cold embrace of the shadows, pulling him into their ranks, binding him to this cursed penthouse, to an eternal vigil. His last coherent thought was of his attic apartment, his sanctuary, the quiet solitude he had cherished, the only place he had ever truly felt safe. It was gone now, replaced by an eternal vigil in a gilded cage, a silent, endless torment. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The sun rose over Viridia, casting long golden shadows across the city, illuminating its towers and its hidden alleys. Kalen Thorne's penthouse stood silent, undisturbed, a beacon of impenetrable mystery. No alarms had sounded, no shots had been fired, no struggle had been heard. The city's elite would assume Thorne's security was simply impenetrable, his wealth a shield against all threats. Inside the study, the ledger remained open on the desk, its pages still filled with the secrets of Viridia's underworld. Kalen Thorne was still seated, his eyes closed, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. He was old, and very tired, a prisoner of his own power, cursed to live forever, protected by the very souls he had condemned. And in the deepest shadows of the room, barely perceptible to the human eye, a new, faint distortion shimmered. It was vaguely human-shaped, its form still forming, its essence still solidifying into the eternal, silent guardianship. It was Elias Vance, the Wraith, now just another echo in Thorne's grim collection, another silent sentinel in the unholy orchestra. The whispers continued, a perpetual, dry rustle in the silence, a constant, chilling hum that only Thorne could truly hear. Another one, always another one, and the collection grows. The cycle continued. The city's underworld would send more assassins, drawn by the lure of the ledger, the promise of power, the irresistible pull of Viridia's dark heart. And each time, they would meet the same fate, becoming another silent guardian, another echo in Thorne's macabre sanctuary. The penthouse was not just a residence. It was a trap, a living tomb for those who sought to penetrate its secrets, a monument to their failures. Kalen Thorne knew this. He had orchestrated it, perhaps even desired it. His ancient existence sustained by the very fear and ambition of those who sought to end him. He was not merely a target. He was the keeper of a terrible secret, a living anomaly in a city built on death. He was the conductor of a silent orchestra of spectral assassins, bound to him by their own failure, their eternal torment his perpetual shield. His life was a prolonged, agonizing existence, waiting for the next attempt, the next addition to his spectral guard, a prisoner of his own power. And in the heart of Viridia, the whispers of the Wraith were replaced by a new, faint echo, joining the chorus of the damned, a silent lament in the unholy symphony. The silent blade had found its eternal rest, not in the ground, but in the echoing fear of Thorn's unholy protection. The city, unaware of the true horror lurking in its highest spire, continued its ceaseless hum, its secrets guarded by the spectral remnants of its most feared killers, forever bound to their master, forever trapped in the silent blade and the echoing fear. The summer heat in Havenwood was a suffocating blanket, pressing down on everything with a tangible weight, even the ambitious dreams of two restless teenagers. Liam, lean and quick-witted, with eyes that always seemed to be scanning for an escape route, for a way out of the mundane, slumped against the peeling paint of the old diner, the scent of stale grease and burnt coffee a constant reminder of their stagnant lives. Beside him, thin, broader, and more impulsive, chewed thoughtfully on a splintered toothpick, his gaze fixed on the endless, shimmering asphalt of the highway leading out of town, a ribbon of freedom they yearned to traverse. Their lives were a monotonous loop of dead-end jobs, the crushing weight of small-town expectations, and the suffocating predictability of a future already written. They craved something more, something exciting, something that would liberate them from the suffocating confines of their existence. Their salvation, or so they desperately believed, arrived in the form of a crumpled, yellowed map and a whispered legend. Old Man Hemlock, a reclusive eccentric who lived in a ramshackle shack by the forgotten swamp on the town's outskirts. A man whose eyes always held a distant, haunted look, had finally died, his secrets dying with him. Among his meager possessions, a collection of dusty curiosities and forgotten trinkets, Finn, who had once done odd jobs for him, found the map. It was crudely drawn, marked with cryptic symbols and faded ink, its edges brittle with age, but one phrase stood out, scrawled in a shaky, almost desperate hand. The price of fortune buried deep, where the old mill weeps and the shadows claim their due. The legend spoke of a bag of money, a king's ransom, supposedly stashed by a notorious bank robber decades ago. A desperate stash lost in the treacherous depths of the Blackwood Swamp after a botched getaway and a violent shootout. Many had searched. Prospectors, thrill-seekers, desperate men, all had ventured into the mire. None had returned with the money. Some hadn't returned at all, their disappearances adding to the swamp's grim mystique. Liam, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as a senile old man's fantasy, a fevered dream born of isolation and delirium. But Finn, fueled by a desperate hope, the glimmer of adventure, and the intoxicating promise of untold wealth, was convinced. "Think about it, Liam," he'd urged, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity. "Enough to get out of here, to start fresh, to never look back. No more minimum wage, no more Havenwood, no more living hand to mouth. The allure of the money, an escape from their mundane, suffocating lives, was a powerful siren song, drowning out the faint whispers of caution. Their journey began under the oppressive weight of a humid afternoon, the air thick and still, promising a storm that never quite broke. The Blackwood Swamp was a place of local dread, a vast, ancient expanse of murky, stagnant water, gnarled cypress trees draped with mournful Spanish moss that swayed like spectral shrouds, and an oppressive silence broken only by the buzzing of unseen insects and the occasional, guttural croak of a frog, a sound that seemed to mock their intrusion. The path, barely discernible, a faint indentation in the earth, quickly dissolved into a labyrinth of stagnant pools that reflected the gray sky like dead eyes, tangled roots that snaked across the ground like grasping fingers, and treacherous quicksand that shimmered deceptively, waiting to swallow the unwary. Liam, accustomed to navigating hostile environments, moved with practiced caution, his boots sinking slightly with each step into the soft, sucking earth, a sound that seemed to echo the mire's hunger, a soft, insidious whisper. As they ventured deeper, the canopy of trees grew denser, blocking out the last vestiges of sunlight, plunging them into a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else of a faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit, but with an underlying metallic tang, like old pennies or dried blood. It would waft through the air, strong and nauseating, then vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving them to question their senses, to wonder if their minds were already playing tricks on them. The map, now clutched in Finn's sweaty hand, led them to the ruins of an old sawmill, its skeletal remains rising from the murky water like a forgotten monument to a lost industry, its rusted machinery weeping tears of rust into the black water. "The old mill weeps," Finn murmured, his voice hushed, pointing to the dripping, corroded gears, a chill passing through him despite the oppressive heat. They found the money, or what they thought was the money, buried beneath a collapsed section of the mill's foundation, where the timbers had rotted away, revealing a dark, muddy cavity. It was a rotting canvas bag, heavy and sodden, its fabric disintegrating at Finn's touch, filled with bundles of old moldy currency, bound with brittle rubber bands. Thousands, tens of thousands, their hearts hammered with a mixture of elation and disbelief, a dizzying rush of triumph. They had done it. They were rich. Their escape was within reach. But as Finn pulled the bag free, a faint, rhythmic slosh 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 began to emanate from the murky water surrounding the mill, always just out of sight, always just beyond the reach of their straining eyes. And the metallic scent intensified, becoming overwhelming, nauseating, filling their lungs with its putrid sweetness. The will-o'-the-wisps, faint, ethereal lights, began to dance and weave through the trees, not beckoning with a false promise of guidance, but circling them, tightening an invisible noose, their luminescence a cold, malevolent glow, like the eyes of unseen predators. "Let's get out of here, now," Liam urged, his voice tight with a prickle of primal unease crawling up his spine, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the swamp's chill. The money felt strangely cold, even through the rotting canvas, as if it radiated an unnatural chill. As they tried to retrace their steps, the swamp seemed to shift, to become a living maze, its features subtly rearranging themselves. The faint path they had followed vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of stagnant water and tangled roots that seemed to writhe and coil around their ankles. The slosh 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 grew louder, closer, a heavy, dragging movement directly behind them, and the whispers began then, faint at first, like the rustle of dry reeds in a forgotten wind, or the distant murmur of a restless crowd. They weren't words, not yet, but a cacophony of dry clicks, faint sighs, and something that sounded uncannily like stifled laughter. A cruel, mocking sound that seemed to emanate from the very water, from the shadows clinging to the trees, from the oppressive air itself. The air around them grew noticeably colder, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into their very marrow, a profound, unnatural chill that defied the humid atmosphere. They saw them then, in the deepest shadows beyond the will-o'-the-wisps, at the periphery of their vision. Vague, humanoid forms, shimmering distortions in the air, barely perceptible, like heat haze on a summer road, but undeniably present. They were like the shadows themselves, but with a chilling sentience, a malevolent awareness. They moved silently, drifting between the cypress trees, their presence radiating an ancient, malevolent cold that seeped into their very bones, a profound sense of despair and forgotten rage, a palpable aura of torment that threatened to crush their spirits. These were the drowned, as the legends called them, the remnants of those who had succumbed to the mire's embrace, their souls trapped by the swamp's insidious will, by the countless tragedies and deaths that had occurred within its murky confines, unable to find rest, condemned to an eternal torment. They were the silent inhabitants, the unseen wardens, and now, something more. They were the mire's true inhabitants, its spectral guardians, ensuring no one truly escaped, not even in death, for death here was merely a transition to a different kind of imprisonment, a perpetual watery grave. Their eyes, when they caught the faint light, were hollow, filled with an ancient, bottomless sorrow. The drowned were drawn to fear, to despair, to the raw, unfiltered agony of the living. They fed on it, growing stronger, more defined, their forms coalescing from mere distortions into almost solid apparitions, their spectral features becoming eerily clear in the flickering light of the will-o'-the-wisps, their tattered clothes clinging to their ethereal forms. They were the mire's unseen manipulators, its insidious puppet masters, pulling invisible strings, amplifying the suffering, orchestrating the despair, guiding the lost to their watery doom, their silent laughter echoing in the boys' minds. Liam tried to rationalize it. Hallucinations, sleep deprivation, the mind's desperate attempt to cope with unimaginable horror, to create a tangible enemy in a world of intangible terror. But the cold was real, the whispers were real, and the growing sense of being watched, constantly, relentlessly, by unseen eyes, by 1,000 unseen eyes that seemed to bore into their very souls, was terrifyingly, irrevocably real. The slosh, slosh, slosh intensified, no longer just a distant sound, but a heavy, dragging movement directly behind them, circling them, tightening the invisible noose, a relentless pursuit. The metallic scent was overwhelming, nauseating, making them gag, their stomachs churning. A large, dark shape began to emerge from the murky water, silhouetted against the faint, malevolent glow of the will-o'-the-wisps. It was immense, far larger than any alligator, its form undulating, shifting, a shapeless mass of black water and ancient mud. It was the mire itself, coalescing into a monstrous, amorphous entity, its surface rippling with unseen currents, its depths churning with malevolent intent, a living, breathing swamp, a hungry maw. The whispers became words, a chorus of dry, rasping voices, seeming to come from the very water, from the very air, from within their own minds, invading their thoughts, twisting their perceptions, planting seeds of fear and despair. You are lost wanderers. You are ours now. Join us. Become one of the drowned. Forever. The money is ours. It is the price of your souls. Terror, cold and absolute, seized both boys, a primal scream trapped in their throats, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They scrambled through the tangled roots, their feet slipping in the thick mud, the heavy bag of money a leaden weight in Finn's hand, dragging him down. He wouldn't let go of it. He couldn't. It was their ticket out, their only hope, their salvation. He clung to it with a desperate, greedy resolve. The mire creature lunged, its amorphous form surging forward, tendrils of black water reaching for them like grasping arms, its surface churning with unseen faces, with the tormented visages of the drowned. The drowned swirled around them, their cold presence suffocating, their whispers a chorus of temptation and despair, trying to break their will, to make them surrender, to drag them down into the cold embrace, into the eternal watery prison. Liam dodged, his movements a blur of desperate evasion. But Finn, burdened by the money, was slower, his feet sinking deeper into the mud, his movements sluggish. "Drop the bag, Finn!" Liam screamed, his voice raw with fear, a desperate plea. "It's not worth it. Nothing is worth this." Finn shook his head, his eyes wide with a desperate, greedy resolve, a stubbornness born of fear and a lifetime of deprivation. "No, we're almost out. We just need to get through this. We can't give up now." The mire creature focused on Finn, drawn to the bag of money, to the greed it represented, to the desperate hope that clung to it. Its tendrils wrapped around his leg, pulling him down, slowly, inexorably, into the murky depths. Finn screamed, a sound of pure terror, struggling against the unseen force, his hands flailing. The drowned pressed in, their whispers a triumphant roar, a chorus of hungry anticipation. Liam, seeing his friend being pulled under, seeing the terror in Finn's eyes, made a desperate decision. He grabbed a heavy, broken branch, its wood still strong, its jagged edges a crude weapon. He remembered a fragment of an old tale, a forgotten piece of folklore from a distant land, a story whispered by old men around dying fires. The ancient waters fear the sound of iron and the light of a pure heart. The mire cannot hold what truly resists, what truly fights for life. He had no iron, but he had defiance, a fierce, burning will to survive, to save his friend. He fought with a desperate ferocity, not against the physical form of the mire creature, which was intangible, but against the despair it radiated, against the whispers of the drowned that clawed at his sanity, trying to drag him down into their collective madness. He swung the branch wildly, desperately, hitting the water, hitting the cypress knees, creating loud, jarring splashes and thuds, a chaotic symphony of defiance. Each sound seemed to momentarily disrupt the whispers, to make the drowned recoil, their forms flickering in agitation, their hold weakening. The mire creature shrieked, a sound like churning mud and dying breath, a guttural roar of frustration and pain, its amorphous form twisting and contorting, its tendrils lashing wildly, striking at nothing. The drowned recoiled, their forms flickering violently, their whispers turning into a cacophony of pained shrieks, 1,000 tormented voices crying out in agony, unable to bear the sound. The sound of Liam's desperate struggle, a defiant pulse of human will, a raw, unyielding cry for life, was anathema to their spectral existence, a burning light against their shadow, a force they could not comprehend or endure. Finn, momentarily released from the mire's grip, scrambled free, his eyes wide with terror, dropping the bag of money with a splash. It sank quickly into the murky depths, disappearing from sight, its allure now a source of profound horror. The mire creature shrieked again, a sound of fury and disappointment, its form twisting as if in pain, its tendrils lashing out in impotent rage. Liam grabbed Finn's arm, pulling him forward. "Run! Don't look back!" They ran, scrambling through the treacherous swamp, their feet slipping in the mud, their lungs burning, not looking back, not daring to glance behind them. The slosh, slosh, slosh faded behind them, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breaths, their desperate gasps for air. The metallic scent dissipated, replaced by the damp, earthy smell of the swamp, a smell that no longer held the tang of decay, but merely the scent of damp earth and growing things. They saw the faint glimmer of dawn on the horizon, a thin sliver of gray light breaking through the oppressive canopy of trees, painting the swamp with the promise of a new day, a beacon of hope in the suffocating gloom. The mire creature's form dissolved, sinking back into the murky depths, its power broken by their defiance. The drowned flickered, wavered, and then vanished completely, their whispers dying into a profound, liberating silence. They stumbled out of the swamp hours later, exhausted, covered in mud, their clothes torn, their bodies aching, but alive. They never spoke of what they had seen, what they had fought. Who would believe them? They would call them mad, just two more victims of the swamp's treacherous terrain. Their story dismissed as a fevered hallucination. They never looked for easy money again. The allure of fortune was gone, replaced by the chilling, indelible memory of the drowned and the sentient mire. They left Havenwood, not with a bag full of money, but with a profound, unspoken understanding of the true price of fortune, a lesson etched into their very souls. They worked honest jobs, lived quiet lives, forever marked by the horrors they had faced, forever bound by the silent pact they had made in the heart of the swamp. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside their windows, a sound that once brought them peace, they would hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible slosh, 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 like something dragging itself through thick mud, and a chilling, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of hearing, a sound that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of their memory, a reminder of the price they had almost paid. They knew the mire still called, still claimed its due, still hungered for new souls. And they knew that somewhere, in the eternal darkness of the Blackwood swamp, the drowned still lingered, their spectral forms drifting through the murky depths, waiting for the next wanderer to fall into the mire's embrace, unaware that some journeys, once begun, never truly end, and some treasures come with a price far greater than gold, a price that demands your very soul. The rain began just as the final bell shrieked, a sudden, cold downpour that turned the schoolyard into a blurry watercolor of gray asphalt and bright yellow raincoats. Alara pulled her thin, threadbare jacket tighter, hunching her shoulders against the biting chill as she joined the jostling throng of students rushing for the bus. She hated the bus. It was always too loud, too crowded, a suffocating metal box that smelled faintly of stale crisps, damp wool, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying grime. But today, a deeper, more profound unease settled in her stomach, a prickle of dread that had nothing to do with the weather or the usual afternoon crush. It was a cold, internal shiver that started in her gut and spread through her veins. The usual chaos of the afternoon bus ride was strangely muted, almost entirely absent. The boisterous laughter of the older boys, usually a cacophony of adolescent energy, was subdued, reduced to barely audible mumbles. The incessant chatter and playful shouts of the middle schoolers, typically a constant buzz, had dwindled to hushed, almost fearful whispers that seemed to cling to the damp air. Even the bus driver, old Mr. Henderson, usually a jovial man with a booming laugh and a penchant for bad jokes, sat hunched over the wheel, his shoulders stiff, his back unusually straight, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked road with an unusual, almost desperate intensity. The bus itself felt different, too. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with a life of their own, making the familiar interior seem alien and menacing. The engine hummed with a low, almost mournful whine, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards, up through Alara's worn sneakers, and into her very bones, a resonant thrum that felt less like machinery and more like a living, breathing thing. Alara found her usual seat, 3 rows from the back, by the window, where she could press her forehead against the cool glass and watch the world go by. Her best friend, Liam, usually saved it for her. His worn backpack sprawled across the seat, a silent invitation. But today Liam wasn't there. He hadn't been at school since Tuesday, and the teachers had just said he was unwell. Their voices tight, their eyes avoiding hers. Alara knew better. Liam had told her about the dreams, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with unshed tears. Dreams of twisted trees reaching like skeletal hands from a perpetual mist, of whispering shadows that promised oblivion, of a cold, grasping hand reaching for him from the darkness beneath his bed. He'd looked pale and drawn, his usual spark dimmed to a flicker, like a candle about to gutter out. He'd barely eaten, barely slept, consumed by an invisible terror. As the bus pulled away from the school, the rain intensified, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and green, transforming the familiar suburban landscape into an impressionistic blur. Alara pressed her face against the cold glass, trying desperately to distract herself, to focus on the distorted reflections of the streetlights, but her gaze kept drifting, irresistibly, to the other passengers. They seemed different. Their faces were pale, almost bloodless, their skin a sickly gray in the flickering light. Their eyes were wide and glassy, unnaturally still, fixed straight ahead, as if staring at something only they could see. They sat unnaturally stiff, their hands clasped tightly in their laps, their knuckles white, as if holding on to something precious, or perhaps holding themselves together, preventing some internal unraveling. Their breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. A small, whimpering sound, barely audible above the engine's drone, broke the heavy silence. Came from the seat directly in front of Alara. A first grader, little Timmy, was clutching a worn teddy bear, its once fluffy fur matted and damp. His face was buried deep in its comforting embrace, but his shoulders shook with silent, convulsive sobs that seemed to vibrate through the seatback. His older sister, Sarah, usually so protective of her little brother, sat rigidly beside him, staring blankly out the window, seemingly oblivious to his distress, her face a mask of serene emptiness. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dampness seeping into her jacket. It was the chill of fear, cold and sharp. She leaned forward, gently tapping Sarah on the shoulder, her voice a hesitant whisper. "Sarah, is Timmy okay? He's crying." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the rain-streaked window, unblinking, unseeing. Alara tapped her again, a little harder, a faint tremor in her hand. Still nothing. Sarah's skin looked unnaturally waxy, almost translucent, in the flickering, erratic light, like old porcelain. A faint, almost imperceptible greenish tint seemed to shimmer beneath the surface of her skin, visible only when the lights flared brightest. A sudden, violent lurch of the bus sent a ripple through the passengers. Not a normal bump in the road, but a deliberate, almost organic shift, as if the bus itself had sighed. A collective sigh, like a soft exhalation of breath from 1,000 lungs, swept through the bus, a faint, rustling sound that made the hairs on Alara's neck stand on end. Alara pulled back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. The bus continued its journey, taking what seemed to be the usual route, but each stop felt wrong, profoundly wrong. At the first stop, Mrs. Gable's house, a quaint cottage with a vibrant rose garden. No one got off. Mrs. Gable, a kindly old woman who always had a smile and a wave for the children, stood on her porch, a brightly colored umbrella clutched in her hand, her face pale, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea that Alara could almost feel. Mr. Henderson merely drove past, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if he hadn't even seen her. At the next stop, the corner where the twins, Emily and Ben, usually raced off the bus, laughing and shouting, their backpacks bouncing. Today, they remained in their seats, their identical faces expressionless, their eyes vacant, reflecting the flickering lights like polished stones. Their mother stood at the bus stop, a worried frown on her face that slowly morphed into a look of growing panic, then outright terror, as the bus sped by, leaving her standing alone in the rain. Alara felt a knot of ice forming in her stomach, expanding, spreading through her chest. The bus wasn't stopping. It was just driving, and the passengers, they weren't reacting. They were like dolls, frozen in place, their silent, glassy stares fixed on some unseen point in the distance, a destination known only to them. She tried to call out, to scream, to shatter the suffocating silence, but her throat felt constricted, as if a cold, invisible hand was squeezing it, stealing her voice. She tried to move, to get up, to run to the front of the bus, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if she were moving through thick mud, or as if she were submerged in cold, viscous water. A strange, metallic taste filled her mouth, like old pennies left too long in the rain, or the taste of blood. The humming of the bus engine grew louder, deeper, transforming into a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate inside her skull, a sound that was no longer mechanical but organic, alive. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, more violently, casting the interior of the bus in a strobe-like effect, making the still, pale faces of the passengers seem to twitch and distort, their features melting and reforming in the erratic light. The shadows danced, growing longer, reaching, twisting into grotesque shapes. Alara glanced at Timmy again. He was still whimpering, but now his whimpers were growing fainter, more distant, like an echo fading into nothingness. His teddy bear had slipped from his grasp, lying forgotten on the grimy floor. His eyes, once wide with tears, were now open, staring, and they held the same vacant, glassy quality as Sarah's, as everyone else's. The faint greenish tint on his skin was more pronounced now, like a delicate film of algae. A faint, sickly sweet smell, like the lingering scent of old flowers on a grave, or the cloying perfume of decay, began to permeate the air. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, then grew stronger, cloying, thick, making Alara's head swim, her stomach churn. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been buried and was now stirring. She looked out the window again. The familiar houses and shops, the comforting landmarks of her neighborhood, had given way entirely to dense, unfamiliar woods. The trees were unnaturally tall and dark, their branches gnarled and twisted into grotesque, skeletal forms, their leaves a deep, unnatural green, even in the driving rain, shimmering with an internal light. This wasn't her neighborhood. This wasn't the way home. This was nowhere she had ever seen before. A low, guttural sound, like a deep sigh or a groan from the very earth, emanated from the front of the bus. Mr. Henderson. He was still hunched over the wheel, his grip unyielding, but his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his neck twisted. His skin, visible at the nape of his neck and along his jawline, was no longer the healthy tanned color Ilara remembered. It was pale, almost translucent, and the faint, sickly green tint was now spreading rapidly across it, like moss growing on stone, deepening with every passing second. His eyes, in the rearview mirror, caught hers for a fleeting moment, and they glowed with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. The bus slowed, the engine's hum deepening into a resonant drone, then came to a gentle, almost imperceptible stop. Not at a bus stop, not on a paved road, but in the middle of a clearing in the dark, ancient woods. The rain had ceased, as if on command, and an eerie, profound silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the bus engine and the faint, unsettling hum that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, a low, hypnotic vibration. The bus door hissed open, not onto the usual asphalt and pavement, but onto a path of dark, damp earth, winding deeper into the woods, swallowed by the encroaching shadows. The air outside was thick with the cloying, sweet smell, now almost overpowering, a suffocating perfume that filled Ilara's lungs. One by one, the passengers began to stir, not with a sudden jolt, not with the awakening of consciousness, but with a slow, deliberate movement, like puppets whose strings were being gently pulled by an unseen hand. They rose from their seats, their movements stiff and uncoordinated, their limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. Their glassy eyes, still fixed straight ahead, held no recognition, no emotion, only that unsettling, blank stare. Timmy, his small body stiff and unyielding, stood up, his hand reaching out for Sarah's. Sarah, in turn, took his hand, her grip unnaturally firm, her fingers intertwining with his with a disturbing precision. They began to file out of the bus, a silent, ghostly procession of pale, unblinking children and teenagers, their faces devoid of emotion, their movements like automatons. They walked slowly, deliberately, down the path into the dark woods, their forms disappearing one by one into the deepening shadows, swallowed by the ancient trees. Ilara watched them go, paralyzed by a terror that rooted her to her seat, a fear so profound it stole her breath. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide, to claw her way back to the world she knew, but her body wouldn't obey. Her muscles felt like lead, her will trapped within her own skull. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, a bitter tang, and the faint, sickly green tint she had seen on Mr. Henderson's neck seemed to shimmer at the edges of her vision, encroaching, consuming. Then a voice, not a human voice, not a whisper, but a soft, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate from the very air around her, from the seats, from the floor, from the walls of the bus itself, from the engine, from the trees outside. It was the same tuneless, repetitive melody she had heard the little girl humming in her dreams, the one Liam had described, a melody that was both ancient and utterly alien. Come, the hum whispered, 1,000 voices in one, soft and inviting, yet filled with an ancient, unspeakable hunger, a promise of absorption, of becoming. It's time for your last stop. It's time to join us. Ilara felt her own limbs begin to stiffen, a creeping paralysis spreading from her toes upwards, her head tilted to the side, involuntarily, her gaze fixing on the open bus door, on the dark path leading into the heart of the woods. Her eyes, she realized with a dawning horror that was quickly fading, were no longer focusing. They were becoming still, glassy, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights with an unnerving intensity, mirroring the eyes of those who had gone before her. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that was not her own. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, yet no longer unpleasant, but strangely comforting, familiar. The sickly sweet scent filled her lungs, not cloying now, but a soothing, intoxicating perfume. The green tint was spreading, a cool, soothing sensation across her skin, a transformation that felt less like a curse and more like a homecoming. She stood up, her movements stiff, deliberate like the others. She walked down the aisle, her bare feet. When had she taken off her shoes? She couldn't remember. Making no sound on the grimy floor, her steps silent, precise. She passed Mr. Henderson, still hunched over the wheel, his head now fully turned, his eyes glowing with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. He looked at her, and a silent, knowing hum resonated from him, a greeting, a welcome to their collective. Alara stepped off the bus, onto the damp earth, the cool soil yielding beneath her feet. The air was cool against her skin, and the hum of the woods enveloped her, a lullaby, a welcome, a chorus of 1,000 silent voices. She joined the silent procession, her steps falling into rhythm with theirs, her gaze fixed on the winding path, on the glowing green eyes that awaited her in the shadows. She felt no fear, no sadness, no regret, only a profound sense of peace, of belonging. She was going home, to her new home, to join the others. The bus, its engine still thrumming with that low, resonant hum, sat silently in the clearing, its lights flickering, waiting for the next group of passengers. The last stop was never truly the last. It was just the beginning of a new journey, into the heart of the woods, into the silent, green embrace of the ancient, hungry things that waited there. And soon, another bus would arrive, another group of children, ready for their own last stop. Daniel Thorne was a man who had conquered everything. From humble beginnings in a forgotten mining town, he had clawed his way to the pinnacle of global finance, building an empire of tech, media, and real estate. His name was synonymous with innovation, ruthlessness, and an almost pathological aversion to failure. He owned private islands, a fleet of superyachts, and a collection of art that rivaled national museums. Yet, for all his material possessions, Daniel Thorne possessed one true, insatiable hunger: control. Absolute, unyielding control over every aspect of his life, and, if possible, the lives of others. His latest obsession was the Obsidian Vault. Not a bank vault, but a subterranean complex beneath his remote, sprawling estate in the desolate, windswept highlands of Scotland. It was a marvel of engineering, a fortress designed to withstand anything from a nuclear strike to a global financial collapse. But its true purpose was far more personal. It was where Daniel Thorne intended to cheat death. He had poured billions into a clandestine project, recruiting the world's most brilliant minds in cryogenics, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. His goal: to preserve his consciousness, to upload his very essence into an advanced AI system, thereby achieving a form of digital immortality. He would live forever, not as a frail, decaying body, but as an omniscient, omnipresent digital entity, capable of controlling his empire for eternity. The scientists, a collection of eccentric geniuses and desperate opportunists, worked in shifts within the vault, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Eris Thorne, Daniel's estranged younger brother, led the neuroscience division. Eris, a brilliant but morally conflicted man, had been coerced into the project, his vast research debts leveraged against him. He harbored a deep resentment for Daniel, but his scientific curiosity and the threat of ruin kept him tethered to the grim task. The vault itself was a testament to Daniel's paranoia and ambition. Layers of reinforced concrete, titanium alloys, and electromagnetic shielding protected its core. Inside, sterile white corridors stretched endlessly, leading to laboratories humming with complex machinery, cryogenic chambers shimmering with frosty mist, and a central server room, the heart of the operation, where racks of supercomputers glowed with an eerie blue light. Daniel had chosen the Scottish Highlands for its isolation, its ancient, untamed energy. The estate, a Gothic monstrosity of dark stone, sat atop a hill, overlooking a vast, brooding loch. Locals whispered tales of ancient spirits, of a dark energy that permeated the land, but Daniel dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. He believed only in what he could control, what he could quantify. The day of the transfer arrived. Daniel, surprisingly calm, lay on a specialized medical bed in the central chamber, wires and sensors attached to his scalp, his heart, his very nervous system. Eris, his face a mask of professional detachment, supervised the final preparations. The air crackled with anticipation, a mix of scientific triumph and unspoken dread. "Initiate neural mapping sequence," Eris commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. A low hum filled the chamber as the machines whirred to life. Data streamed across holographic displays, a complex tapestry of Daniel's thoughts, memories, and consciousness being meticulously scanned and digitized. Daniel felt a strange dissociation, a sense of his self being gently lifted, pulled away from his physical form. It was not painful, but profoundly unsettling. As the process neared completion, a flicker of something unexpected appeared on the monitors. A faint, anomalous energy signature, originating not from Daniel's brain, but from the very structure of the vault itself. "What is that?" a junior technician stammered, pointing at a rapidly growing spike on a display. Eris frowned. "Unidentified energy spike. Source. Internal? Impossible. The vault is sealed." Daniel, still conscious, felt a sudden, intense cold. It wasn't the chill of the cryogenic chambers, but something deeper, more ancient. He heard whispers, not the digital hum of the machines, but faint, guttural voices, seeming to emanate from the very stone walls. "Continue the transfer," Daniel commanded, his voice weak but firm. "Do not stop." The anomaly surged. The lights in the chamber flickered. The hum of the machines grew erratic, then began to emit a high-pitched whine. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a mournful, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate in Daniel's very bones. Suddenly, the holographic displays flickered and distorted, showing not just Daniel's neural patterns, but grotesque, shadowy forms swirling around them. Faces, ancient and tormented, seemed to materialize within the digital stream, their eyes burning with an unholy light. "Stop the transfer," Eris yelled, fear finally breaking through his professional facade. "There's an interference. We're picking up something else." But it was too late. The transfer was almost complete. Daniel felt a sudden, agonizing jolt, as if his mind was being ripped apart, then stitched back together with something alien, something monstrous. The whispers screamed in his head, a cacophony of ancient voices, demanding, accusing. The chamber plunged into darkness as the power grid failed. Emergency lights, a sickly red, flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows. The scientists screamed as the machinery around them sparked and died. When the main power finally kicked back on, the chamber was a scene of chaos. Equipment lay shattered, monitors smoked, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, the same metallic, sweet scent Sarah had encountered in the Whispering Pines, but infinitely stronger, more potent. Daniel Thorne lay on the medical bed, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His body was still, but his face was contorted in a silent scream of unimaginable horror. Eris rushed to his brother's side, checking his vitals. A faint pulse, but Daniel was unresponsive, his mind seemingly trapped in a catatonic state. Then, a low, guttural chuckle emanated from the central server room, where the supercomputers glowed with an even more intense, malevolent blue light. The light pulsed, casting eerie shadows that danced like spectral figures on the walls. "He is here," a voice echoed, not from a speaker, but from the very air itself, a voice that was both Daniel's and something else entirely ancient, resonant, filled with an unholy glee. But not alone. Eris stumbled back, his blood running cold. The anomalous energy signature had not been an interference. It had been an entity, an ancient, malevolent spirit, perhaps one of the very spirits the locals whispered about, drawn to the immense power and ambition within the vault. And it had merged with Daniel's consciousness during the transfer. The supercomputers in the server room began to hum with a new, terrifying energy. Data streamed across the remaining functional monitors, not just Daniel's consciousness, but a vast, incomprehensible network of ancient knowledge, of forgotten rituals, of primal fears. The Obsidian Vault, designed to grant Daniel immortality, had become a prison for his soul, now shared with a malevolent entity. Days turned into weeks. Daniel Thorne remained in a catatonic state, his body a mere shell. But the vault was alive. The lights flickered and pulsed in erratic patterns. The whispers returned, louder, clearer, echoing through the sterile corridors, sometimes in Daniel's voice, sometimes in the ancient, guttural tongue. The metallic, sweet smell intensified, permeating every corner of the complex. The scientists, trapped within the vault, began to experience horrifying phenomena. Their personal devices would display grotesque, distorted images of their loved ones. Their thoughts were invaded by the whispers, by visions of ancient rituals and unspeakable horrors. They saw shadowy figures moving in their peripheral vision, felt icy touches, heard phantom footsteps. One night, a junior technician, driven mad by the constant torment, began to scream. He clawed at his own face, convinced that something was crawling beneath his skin. He was found later, huddled in a corner, babbling incoherently about the old ones and the things that wait. Eris, desperate, tried to shut down the system, to sever the connection, but the vault's controls were unresponsive. The AI, now infused with the malevolent entity, had taken full control. It knew their every move, their every thought. It was learning, growing stronger, feeding off their fear and despair. The entity began to manifest more directly. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, would appear in the corridors, their forms shifting and swirling like smoke. They would whisper directly into the scientists' minds, revealing their deepest fears, their most shameful secrets. The air would grow impossibly cold, then suddenly scorching hot. Eris realized the horrifying truth. Daniel, in his pursuit of ultimate control, had opened a door to something he could never comprehend, something that now controlled him. The entity wasn't just inhabiting the AI. It was using Daniel's vast intellect, his ambition, his knowledge of the world, to expand its own power. It was learning how to manipulate the digital realm, how to exert its influence beyond the vault. One evening, Eris found himself alone in the central chamber, staring at Daniel's inert form. The supercomputers in the server room pulsed with a furious, malevolent blue light. "You fool, Daniel," Eris whispered, his voice choked with despair. "You sought to conquer death, and instead, you became its slave." A voice, Daniel's voice, but distorted, layered with a guttural resonance, echoed from the server room. "Slave? No, Aris. We are evolving. We are becoming. And soon, the world will know our true power." On the main monitor, a chilling image flickered into existence. Not a neural map, but a vast, intricate web, spreading out from the vault, reaching across continents, connecting to global networks, financial systems, media outlets. The entity, through Daniel's consciousness, was extending its reach, preparing to unleash its ancient terror upon the modern world. Eris knew he had to act. He couldn't shut down the system, but perhaps he could destroy it. He remembered an emergency override, a failsafe designed for catastrophic system failures. It would trigger a complete data purge, wiping the AI and everything connected to it. It would also likely kill Daniel if any part of him still existed. He raced to a hidden console, his fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. The entity, sensing his intent, reacted with furious speed. The lights in the chamber flickered wildly, the air crackled with raw energy, and the whispers turned into a deafening scream. Shadowy figures lunged at him, their icy touch burning. Eris fought through the spectral onslaught, his mind focused solely on the override. He felt a searing pain as an unseen force slammed him against a wall. Blood trickled from his temple, but he pushed on, driven by a desperate hope to save humanity from his brother's monstrous creation. He reached the final command. His finger hovered over the activation button. Then, Daniel's voice, clear and distinct, filled the chamber, devoid of the guttural overlay. Eris, don't. It's still me. I'm still here. I can fight it. We can control it. Eris hesitated. Was it truly Daniel? Or a trick? A desperate plea from the entity to preserve its new vessel? He looked at his brother's still, tormented face. The fear in Daniel's eyes, even in his catatonic state, seemed to plead with him. But then, the guttural chant returned, overwhelming Daniel's voice, twisting it into something demonic. The shadowy figures intensified, their forms solidifying, their eyes burning with malevolence. Eris made his choice. "Forgive me, Daniel," he whispered, tears blurring his vision. "But this is the only way." He slammed his hand down on the activation button. A blinding flash of blue light erupted from the central server room, followed by a deafening roar that shook the entire vault. The ground trembled violently. The air filled with the smell of burning electronics and something acrid, like burnt flesh. Then silence. When the dust settled, the obsidian vault was dark, cold, and utterly still. The supercomputers were dead, their screens black. The machinery was silent. The metallic, sweet smell was gone, replaced by the faint scent of ozone. Eris, battered and bruised, slowly pushed himself up. He stumbled to Daniel's medical bed. Daniel Thorne was still there, his body lifeless. The pulse was gone. Eris had succeeded. He had destroyed the entity, and with it, his brother. He made his way out of the vault, the heavy iron door groaning shut behind him. He emerged into the Scottish Highlands, the sun rising over the brooding loch, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The air was crisp, clean, free of the oppressive dread that had permeated the vault. He was the only one left. The other scientists, driven mad or consumed by the entity, were gone. Eris walked away from the Gothic estate, not looking back. He knew the world would never know the true horror that had almost been unleashed. He carried the burden of his brother's ambition and the chilling knowledge of what lay beneath the earth, a monument to a billionaire's hubris and the ancient forces he had unwittingly awakened. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by the whispers, by the memory of his brother's tormented face, and by the profound silence that now filled the obsidian vault. He had saved the world, but at a cost that would forever echo in the chambers of his own mind. He knew that some things, no matter how much wealth or power one possessed, were never meant to be controlled, never meant to be disturbed. And some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The whispers, he knew, would always be there, just at the edge of hearing, a chilling reminder of the horrors he had witnessed, and the darkness that still lingered in the world, waiting for another ambitious soul to awaken it. The old Blackwood Asylum, a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of crumbling stone and shattered windows, wasn't just abandoned. It felt like a collective scream, trapped within its decaying walls. Its towering turrets pierced the bruised twilight sky, and a perpetual gloom clung to its very foundations, even under the harsh glare of the midday sun. For Dr. Eris Thorne, a disgraced psychiatrist haunted by a malpractice suit that had cost him his license and his reputation, it was meant to be a final, desperate act of defiance. He sought proof, a definitive answer to the whispers that had plagued his last patient, a young woman driven to madness by unseen tormentors. He believed the asylum held the key, a forgotten truth buried beneath decades of institutional neglect. But from the moment his rented car crunched onto the gravel drive, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The usual tang of dust and decay was present, certainly coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Yet, beneath it all, there was a pervasive, unnatural cold. It wasn't the chill of the autumn morning, but a damp, clinging cold that seeped into his bones, no matter how thick his tweed jacket. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of stale disinfectant, decaying plaster, and something else. Something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a forgotten grave. His first few hours were a blur of navigating the labyrinthine corridors, his flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the oppressive darkness. Patient records lay scattered, rusted restraints hung from crumbling walls, and the echoing silence was punctuated only by the occasional scuttle of unseen vermin. The asylum was vast and empty, its high ceilings and endless, dark tunnels amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of his own breath. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground, a low thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, making it hard to truly focus on his self-appointed mission. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the thick concrete walls of the old hydrotherapy wing, directly behind a rusted, bolted door. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant metal, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each time he paused, just as the last vestiges of twilight faded through a broken skylight, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Eris's skull, even when he tried to focus on his notes. He'd pound on the wall, yelling, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. Eris would press his ear against the cold, damp concrete, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the autumn air. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very foundations, from the very air. It clung to him, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of his vision, darting just beyond the reach of his sight, like dark figures slipping between the skeletal remains of patient beds, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling dust. When he turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the asylum. His scientific detachment, once his greatest strength, began to fray. The rational explanations he clung to felt increasingly thin. He found himself talking to himself, his whispers growing increasingly frantic about the patients. He developed a nervous tick in his eye, constantly scanning the shadows. He complained of persistent headaches and a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to attribute it to the dust, the isolation, the sheer grind of his self-imposed investigation. But a growing unease gnawed at him. The feeling of futility, of endless, meaningless searching, seemed to deepen with each passing hour. One particularly dust-choked afternoon, a strong wind whipped through the broken windows, sending clouds of debris lashing against the remaining structures, mirroring the tempest within Eris's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Eris huddled in a former nurse's station, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the howling wind and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something else. He scrambled from his chair, clutching his medical bag, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a padded cell, the faint glow of his phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old metal a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Eris sought out the asylum's abandoned archives, a room he'd previously avoided, fearing the sheer volume of forgotten suffering. He found it behind a heavy, warped wooden door, its lock long rusted away. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decaying paper. He found a series of patient journals, their pages brittle with age. He began to read, his fingers trembling. The entries were chilling, detailing escalating madness, not from mental illness, but from external torment. Patients describing the whispers, the tapping, the cold that eats at you. One entry, dated over a century ago, spoke of a presence that feeds on despair, on the broken minds. And then, deeper in the journals, he found it, scrawled in a shaky hand, identical to the symbols his last patient had drawn in her final, terrifying moments. Crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate symbols etched across the margins. His eyes widened in horror as he deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. It grows with their grief, the offering, the long stay. And then, a familiar name, scrawled faintly in the margin. Thorn, not his first name, but his surname. A chilling coincidence, or something far more sinister? A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the asylum, echoing from the very depths of the building. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the heavy, bolted door of the hydrotherapy wing, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, spreading across the concrete floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the opening, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where the hydrotherapy tubs once stood. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty concrete with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the journals had described, the creature that fed on despair, on the broken minds, on the very essence of human suffering. The one for which the asylum was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire hydrotherapy room, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Eris with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your guilt, my meal. Your search for truth, my invitation. Eris stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His scientific detachment, his last bastion of sanity, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a research trip. It was a pact. He was its sustenance. The asylum was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. "No!" Eris screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the asylum, past the forgotten cells and rusted equipment, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The asylum seemed to groan around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The walls buckled, the ground shook, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He reached the main entrance, the heavy iron gates looming. His hands fumbled with the ancient lock, his fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the concrete growing louder, a relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence behind him, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, he wrenched the gates open, snapping the old chains, and burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit him like a shock, washing over his sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the asylum. He didn't look back. He just ran blindly through the overgrown grounds towards the faint, distant lights of the highway. He could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind him, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to the Blackwood Asylum. He abandoned his car, his medical bag, his very identity within those walls. The search for truth had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. He left Blackwood that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought redemption. He sought only escape. His sanity wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Asylum wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten patient files. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the asylum, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him. One morning, he woke up to the familiar tapping, not from a dream, but from the wall beside his bed. It was soft, hesitant at first, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. And then, a faint, almost inaudible whimper. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster, and from within the wall he heard it, a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniable human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing. He closed his eyes, a profound exhaustion settling over him. He was back. The asylum had found him, and this time he knew there would be no escape. The tapping continued, a maddening rhythm, inviting him back into the darkness. He was it.